Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade in the 769th year of the 41st millennium. A year significant for seeing one of the largest and perhaps the most pivotal battle during this portion of the Imperial Crusade. The battle for the Hive world of Vervunhive. The planet was a major manufacturing and refinement center on the coreward side of the Sabbat worlds. The planet's remarkable industrial output owed much to its interesting local political structure, where dozens of noble houses spread across the major hives, such as Vervunhive, Crusade, and Vanik hive, competed with one another to fulfill Imperial tithes and trade demands as swiftly and efficiently as possible, thus gaining status, recognition, and authority in turn. Obviously, there were several other levers of local power being acted upon by the various families, but this, the world's value to the wider Imperium, was one of the greatest and most important to be acted upon. This in large part due to the planet's long and boisterous history of internecine conflict. See, the Imperium doesn't really care if a planet is currently engaged in a bit of civil war nonsense. So long as the Imperium's tithes are fulfilled, they view this as an entirely internal matter, and, in essence, no business of the Imperium. What is the Imperium's business, however, is aforementioned tithes. And it is therefore quite common for participants in a civil war to appeal to the Imperium for aid by offering them a greater share of the planet's resources, or by simply claiming that they are capable of delivering the tithe, whereas their opponents are not. And obviously, whichever party gets the Imperium on its side is going to have an enormous advantage in any kind of local conflict. And so, as a result, whatever house currently holds the most favor with the Imperium holds a lot of political power as well. The power to call upon Big Brother for aid, or to keep Big Brother out of it, should the political party in question decide that a bit of a more ambitious cleansing is in order. Naturally, all of these rules fly right out the window when chaos or Xenos activity is involved, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. As one can handily imagine, the world's industrial output of course made it a tempting target for Chaos forces during the collapse of Imperial governance in the Sabbat worlds. However, Vervunhive nevertheless lived a rather charmed existence, as Chaos did not attack the world. But why? Surely access to Vervunhive's industrial capacity would be invaluable, not to mention its natural resources, which is of course all true, but all of that local industry, along with a long and proud history of local warfare, meant that the planet was also very heavily defended. The largest and most dominant hive on the planet, Vervunhive, was not only protected by enormous, heavily fortified armed and armored curtain walls with shield generators and massive bastion fortresses, but also by a standing army of 500,000 Vervun primary armed forces. These were not to be recruited from in the case of an Imperial Guard regiment's raising. They were trained, equipped, and armed solely for the defense of Vervunhive. They even boasted significant numbers of main battle tanks, of proper Imperial-grade Lehman Russ's self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. And on top of this came another force of a further 70,000 auxiliary troops, second-line reservists. And in addition to this would be whatever militia troops could be raised from the local populace, numbering in the tens of millions. Even if Anarch Nadzibar had brought the full might of his military force to bear on Verghast, the world would have taken years to conquer at the very least, and quite probably decades. The industrial capacity of the planet, which would on all due likelihood be reduced to dust anyways, was simply not worth such a tremendous expenditure of time and resources at a time when the Anarch's primary goal was to rush as far forward as possible to establish his shield against the Imperium. And so, due to circumstances outside of its control, Verghast was spared Chaos's attention, and now that news came of the defeat of the enemy at Balhat, and the unstoppable, gloriously victorious advance of the War Master Makaroth's forces, it seemed as if Verghast would never know the touch of chaos. But, as they say, if something appears too good to be true, that's probably because it is. But to see precisely how, we need a bit of a change of perspective and time, as we head back to the Battle of Balhat, where within the first 5 or 6 odd days of the war beginning, both in the void and on the ground, it became apparent to those with the perspective to see that this was not going the arch-enemy's way. And whilst loyalty unto death is a common feature found amongst the zealous lower ranks of the Chaos armies, it is a very rare trait indeed amongst its commanders. And as it so happens, the commanders are obviously also the ones in possession of this perspective required to see when a campaign is just not working out very well. Therefore, it should come as a very small surprise indeed that many of the Anarch's chief lieutenants began abandoning him the moment it became clear that he could not pull off a victory on Balhat. One of these commanders was heritor Asphodel, the leader of the Heritor College. He had previously been quite a pain in the Imperium's neck on 2 previous occasions, primarily because of his obsession with creating woe machines. Mechanical monsters of insidious complexity, the likes of which the Imperium had rarely seen before, thus enhancing the rumors that he was in some way attached to the Adeptus Mechanicus. But of course, he was not shackled by their limitations or doctrine. Thus, Asphodel was more than happy to introduce other aspects into his machines, demons or infernal sorcery, letting him create weapons that would be, well, quite literally, physically impossible. This put him pretty high up on the list of Chaos leaders that the Imperium wanted hunted down and dealt with as soon as possible. In a serious effort to track down Chaos leaders was, of course, undertaken after the crushing victory on Balhat. And whilst there were some successes, like, for example, the capture of Shoal and Skara, nothing had been seen or heard of Asphodel after the defeat on Balhat. This, in all due likelihood, was because, while so many other magisters saw this as merely a breaking of the front line, a setback from which they and their unmatched brilliance would of course recover, heritor Asphodel instead saw a major strategic failure. as he had significantly more vision than your average war leader. Thus, instead of falling back to the nearest world and beginning to rearm and reorganize, he set his sight on a true prize, a world that had so far been bypassed, the world of Verghast. As we've already covered, the world was a valuable prize for the forces of chaos, but an outright invasion had been deemed too costly and too risky an undertaking. But as Asphodel had no doubt been forced to abandon the vast majority, if not indeed all, of his forces on Balhut to guarantee his own escape, bearing in mind yet again that the world will have been surrounded by Imperial Navy warships at the time, then, well, heritor Asphodel was not likely to have a surplus of military forces to waste anyways. For him, it became a do-or-die gambit, where if he succeeded, he would gain control over billions of individuals, and a manufacturing base large enough to equip this new gargantuan army of cultists. And if he failed, well, he would be dead and unremembered, and would therefore hardly be overly bothered by the outcome. But even an unarmed lieutenant of chaos is far from harmless, of course. He had no doubt already studied the history of the world of Verghast. He had looked into the various trade wars that had ravaged its surface, and so he picked the hive most likely to be willing to do next to anything to get revenge upon their enemies. The hive of Verzoika, which had lost a recent, massive and pivotal trade war to Vervunhive and an alliance of other hive cities. Verzoika, therefore, and its master were desperate. They were at their lowest ebb, and vulnerable to a kind and well-meaning stranger arriving from somewhere unbeknownst to them, who promised them riches, who promised them technology, and who was capable of delivering as well. Can you imagine what a mind like heritor Asphodel could have done to the mining output, for example, of Verzoika's mines, or the mechanical wonders he could have created with little to no effort? Now, yeah, sure, the new drilling machines might have moaned weirdly at their operators, and the cranes, walking by themselves to the construction site, might have some additional wiggly bits here and there, but it was restoring Verzoika's honor, so who would dare question it? And as the hive welcomed with open arms one gift after the other, the heritor's status within the hive would naturally rise and rise and rise until he was whispering in the ear of its ruling noble classes, and eventually in the ear of the hive's high master himself, and others willing to listen as well. Thus, by the time of the year 769, Verzoika had fallen completely under the sway of heritor Asphodel, who now would begin moving against the other major hives on the world, in an effort to secure the entire planet, preferably swiftly, so as to prevent any outside involvement. He had laid certain plans for this, but even the plans of the great enemy does not always survive contact with the foe. We are, however, getting a bit ahead of ourselves. In Vervunhive, news of the brewing war arrived, to no great excitement, really. Verzoika was rising yet again, the traditional enemy was stirring, But shortly after their major defeat in the previous trade war, another conflict would be a swift and decisive affair, quickly resolved in Vervunhive's favour, now that it was under the command of the next generation of Hive Masters, High Master Sondar, who had taken over from his illustrious father, the man who had defeated Pharazoika the last time around. Plus, Vervunhive still enjoyed the Imperium's favour. It had along with it representatives of the Imperium. It possessed its finest war machines and a significant professional military. It seemed complete and utter madness for Pharazoika to march to war now. Not that it really mattered, of course. General Vergolian of the 1st Vervun Primary Armed Forces Armored Divisions mustered his men and issued forth from the great hive city of Vervunhive to bring the war to the enemy, and the conflict to a quick and a resolute end, as he was planning to destroy whatever minuscule forces Pharazoika could have been able to muster together on such short notice, then join together with the other allied hive forces, like the northern colonies, for example, and the hive of Vanik, before moving on Pharazoika itself, besieging it and defeating it. And coming along for the ride was the Imperium's highest-ranking representative on the world, Commissar Pius Kaur, who had been dispatched by personal order of the old War Master Slado, a sure sign of the Imperium's favour. The city itself, Vervunhive, was unlikely to receive any sort of damage or danger, and thus work shifts and everything else continued as per normal. But General Vergolan, leading the Vervun Primary Armored Forces, was in for a little bit of a surprise. He had, by quite some margin, cleared the outskirts of the city, the enormous mining complexes and the countless smelteries, where he encountered the first element of the Pharazoican forces. These were evidently the rapid scouting elements of the advancing host. It was impressive that they'd managed to get this close to Vervunhive without anybody noticing them, and it spoke to a significant degree of mobility, but again, it was probably just a maddened rush to try and catch Vervunhive off guard and establish some sort of a cordon or a siege pattern before the Vervun primary forces could break out. Well, that had already failed, and all General Vergolan needed to do now was smash these advanced upstart forces. They were equipped primarily with light armored cars and some armored personnel carriers. Nothing before his mighty force of main battle tanks and self-propelled artillery. He smashed apart these leading elements only to be faced with yet further reconnaissance forces following up behind them, which he smashed in turn, even as yet further forces began to appear on his flanks. This was evidently, by the sheer scale and scope of the opposing forces, not merely some far-flung advanced scouting force. There were thousands of armored vehicles all around his troops. They were absolutely no match whatsoever for the Lehman Russers under his command, blasting them apart by the dozen, but more appeared every moment. Was this perhaps some new form of tactic, some attempt at hyper-mobile warfare to rush down Vervunhive or cut off and separate his own armored elements from the safety of the Hive City? If that was the case, it would be a flimsy attempt. All he need do was either burst through it or turn around and drive back to the city gates. But just as the thought formed in Vergolan's head, it was interrupted by the whine of heavy shells, as artillery began to bracket his positions. And nothing light either. This was no desultory mortar barrage. Enormous artillery shells that could only have been flung from self-propelled guns of equal size to his own Earthshakers were raining on his position in seemingly absurd numbers. General Vervunhive was not the foremost military commander of the Vervunhive for nothing. He had seen plenty of live fire exercises. He had witnessed the full might of the wall guns open up, hundreds if not thousands of cannons of every caliber blanketing an area. It was a show of force he had considered awe-inspiring. And yet it was a petty showing compared to the fire he was receiving now. He could no longer even hear the individual explosions, just one enormous, long, consistent roar, buffeting his tank, seemingly penetrating its thick armored walls to catch the sheer cacophony within his vehicle. All other source of noise was lost. He could no longer hear his tank's engine. He could no longer hear the discharge of its cannon, even as he saw it buck in its cradle as another Pharazoican armored vehicle was destroyed. The only reason he knew something had been hit was because of a blossom of fire seen through his rangefinders. Even the words of his fellow commanders shouted in his earpiece was barely audible. And what little he could pick up told him that the mounted infantry attached to his armored spearheads was suffering terribly, being quite literally shattered by the enemy's artillery. He could do nothing but hope that his forces could weather this apocalyptic storm, and weather it they did for many, many minutes until miraculously the barrage began to lift and shift away from them. Breathing a sigh of relief, the general thought that perhaps the Pharazoicans had run low on ammunition. Perhaps this was another part of the ploy, to attempt to overwhelm the Vervun primary forces in an enormous barrage, shattering their morale, a battlefield tactic. But looking around and calling in reports, he still had significant armored forces under his command. The mounted infantry had suffered dreadfully, but it too was still a force to be considered. And surely the Pharazoican light armored forces must be beginning to run out of steam by now. His troops must have destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of their armored vehicles, and slaughtered thousands of supporting infantry. The back of the Pharazoican army must be breaking, and if it was not, it soon would be, until he leant into his observation scope yet again, and from the command cupola of his Lehman Russ main battle tank he observed a sight that seemed inconceivable. A solid wall of ochre-colored armor coming towards him like some dreadful tidal wave of steel. Thousands upon thousands of tanks, hundreds of self-propelled guns seen in the distance behind them, and further still tens of thousands of armored personnel carriers, of trucks and of tractors carrying yet further guns. His force was not merely outnumbered. It was of such insignificance that the enemy's advanced scouting forces had not been engaging the Vervun primary armor. They had simply been passing through them, as one might infantry outposts during a massed border invasion. And as General Vervunhive observed the incoming mass of armor, it flashed and fired in unison. A last desperate order to resist died on the general's lips as his world was transformed into fire and shattered metal. As the expeditionary armored army of Vervunhive ceased to exist. After the battle, although one really could only call it a battle if one felt some sense of pity towards the Vervun primary forces who were destroyed in it. For the Pharazoican forces certainly did not see it as one. It was barely even registered by their armies as they closed in on Vervunhive. They started setting up siege artillery pieces, super heavy cannons with range beyond virtually anything that had been seen on the planet before, and began to shell the hive proper. They had clearly taken their time to infiltrate Vervunhive before the war had begun, as they had identified important through passes, highways, arteries of the hive and the city, its massive urban sprawl, barracks, gathering yards, any and all point of strategic value had been pre-mapped and targeted. So that when the first shells, each the size of a ground car, began to strike the hive just before nightfall, they did tremendous damage to the hive, the city sprawl, the outlying districts, and its infrastructure. And yet, despite the shelling, the city's shields were not raised. The High Master of Vervunhive, Salvador Sondar, was ensconced within his sensory tank, as he was virtually all the time these days, and refused anyone entrance to his quarters to talk to him. The bombardment would continue for quite some time, a disturbingly long period in which thousands lost their lives, until finally, deep within his tank, Salvador Sondar himself realized that his city was taking damage. The hive was hurting. But this was impossible. He had received every reassurance from Pharazoica of friendship. He had spoken to Pharazoica on multiple occasions. They were his allies, his close confidants. And any suggestion that they might declare war upon him or harm him in any way was ridiculous, right? Just like those mewling noises from one of the High Council's representative, a man whose blood was currently soaking into the carpet of the High Master's office. But the hive was taking damage. This was the only thing that Salvador Sondar knew for sure. And so he decided he needed time to make sense out of this seemingly absurd situation. And so finally, the shields were raised, and the shells stopped falling on the hive and the inner city, splashing instead harmlessly on the massive energy umbrella erected over the hive by a multitude of shield pylons. This was, of course, little comfort for the millions of individuals working in the outskirts of the hive city. Well over 15 million people either lived outside the house or had employment outside of it. And the simple fact that it was nearing night time was no reason to assume that these areas were unoccupied. The industry of the Imperium runs always, regardless of whether it is night or day. The day shift would simply be the fortunate ones that escaped the slaughter. The rest of the 15 million were now stuck outside of the hive's primary bastion walls and could only re-enter it through a handful of massive fortified gates. And the overwhelming majority would have to do so on foot, as most of those who were working in the outskirts had arrived via mag trains, and all of the mag train stations and connections had been destroyed in the opening bombardment. There was no re-entering Vervunhive through those ports. and those who lived in the outer city were mostly too poor to afford any sort of conveyance whatsoever. Those who did have a conveyance was no doubt utilizing it this very moment to head towards the fortress gates and the relative safety of Vervunhive itself. Tens of thousands of civilians would die in the press to reach those fortress gates, either crushed by their fellow Imperial citizens in the maddened stampede to reach safety, or blasted to pieces as enormous artillery shells fell into the throngs of retreating refugees as the Pharozoican guns retrained their barrels on the outer city. And the cruelest fate of all was visited upon refugees streaming through Sondar Gate. The gate through which the Vervun primary forces had issued so proudly shortly before, and the gates that aforementioned armored survivors were attempting to traverse yet again, but now in maddened retreat. But the gates, of course, and the paths and roadways leading up to the gates were all chock full of refugees. The armor could move no further, even as the Pharozoicans were closing in on their tail, even as artillery shells continued to fall amongst them. This is when Commissar Pius Cowell, having assumed command after the death of General Vogolan, issued his order to all surviving Vervun primary armored forces elements to drive forward towards the gates and through them as if there was nothing in their way, and to clear the path with heavy bolters and stubbers if needed. A cold-blooded decision that would have been labeled an unexcusable atrocity in any other situation. But not in this situation. Vervunhive needed every tank destroyer, every self-propelled gun, and every soldier it could possibly get right now. And if that came at the cost of a few thousand civilians that none would ever know were slain by their own, well, sacrifices are as always a necessity in war. As for the command structure of the Hive itself, the various leaders of the noble houses of Gavunda, Yech, Rodin, Anko, Crow, Pidestro, Nomfrenti, and Vivek had been arguing loudly and insistently for quite some time now. They had seen the coming war with Pharozoica from quite some distance away. They had seen the rise in tension. They had beseeched the Hive Master Salvador Sondar to do something, to begin preparations, to reach out to the other hives, but they had been ignored again and again. And just as a rebellious mood began to set in, Salvador Sondar revealed himself to the crowd and reassured them that all would be well, that the shields had been raised, that all necessary measures were being taken, and furthermore, that the Imperium was asked for its aid in the war against the Pharozoican madness. He received a standing ovation for his declaration, even though some amongst the crowd did so out of politeness rather than genuine exuberance, having noticed that this was not actually Salvador Sondar at all, but rather one of his servitors, a fancy flesh puppet, one of the deviant Hive Master's fetishes, crafting beautiful if disturbing-looking servitors to attend him in his sensory tank. In general, there were many amongst the noble houses who were not particularly fond of Salvador Sondar, who viewed him as an apple that had fallen some significant distance from the tree of his forefathers, a indolent, lazy master at best, and an incompetent danger at worst. But this was not the time to make a move against the Hive Master. And so, a period of relative political unity came across the Hive, as the remnants of the Vervun primary armored forces were brought into the city, and Commissar Pyre's Cowl was dubbed the hero of the people for his efforts in rescuing the remnants of the expeditionary force. And with the death in battle, of course, of the previous commander of the Vervun primary forces, General Vergolin, new commanders needed to be elected in this time of war. The House Legislature came together and named 2 new representatives. The new Supreme Commander of Vervunhive and all its armed forces would be Marshal Edric Crow, answerable only to Salvador Sonda. And as an immediate political counterweight to focusing so much power in the hands of one family, the Crows, he was immediately also appointed a second-in-command, General Hesketh Anko, who would be his dutiful adjutant, and also rapid replacement should the Marshal overstep. And with Imperial Guard forces on the way, of course, both of these commanders would also have, at the very least, an equal and probably, in all due essentiality, a superior in the highest-ranking Imperial Guard officer, which just happened to be our old familiar friend, General Noches Sturm, and his Royal Vulpen. And whilst the general had brought with him a fairly significant Imperial Guard force, it was not an enormous one. The Imperial Guard came to Vervunhive assuming that they would participate in a local Verhastian conflict, that they were outsiders come to give a helping hand to settle this dispute as rapidly as possible, and that they would find 2 loyal Imperial forces where their show of force might very well be enough to settle the whole thing right then and there. Still, to manage to settle something swiftly, a show of force is required. Thus, Noches Storm brought with him the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd Royal Vulpen regiments, in addition to, presumably, the Vulpen 50th, as another acquaintance of ours, Gizom Danver de Banzi Heit Gilbert, was also on world. The Major, of course, was the commander of the Royal Vulpen 50th, which was also Noches Sturm's personal regiment, so it seems unlikely he would have left them behind. In addition to the Vulpen forces also came the 5th and the 7th Rowan Deepers regiments under the command of General Nash, along with the Tarnith 1st and only under the command of Colonel Ibrahim Gaunt, and 3 regiments of Narmenian armor, under another old acquaintance of ours, Coron Grismund, the inspired armored commander that had secured victory on the world of Kokiamenus. He had by now been promoted to the rank of general, but Noches Sturm was his senior and therefore in de facto command over the more recently elevated Grismund. All in all, the Imperial Guard reinforcements probably numbered around 20 to 30,000 men, although exact numbers are difficult to estimate because the Imperium absolutely loathes any form of standardization whatsoever ever. But the Imperium were not the only ones rallying to the side of Vervunhive. As mentioned previously, the trade war against Ferozoica nearly 100 years ago was won by an alliance of hive cities, an alliance still largely intact. Thus, Vervunhive could call upon the aid of the northern colonies, whom dispatched another 10 regiments, with a further 9 regiments also arriving from Vanik Hive. This would add another 50, 60, 70,000 or so men to the already existing 500,000 of Vervun primary troops. Thus, in total, Vervunhive was protected by somewhere in excess of 600,000 professional soldiers, in addition to the aforementioned 70,000 auxiliaries, and by now, in all due likelihood, tens of thousands of militia forces, recruited from amongst the various workers flooding into the hive from the rapidly ruined outer parts of the city. The refugees were another problem as well. Flooded by millions upon millions of homeless refugees, the logistical system of Vervunhive was beginning to creak and moan under the strain. They would need housing, they would need feeding, they would need access to clean water and medical facilities. Not to mention, of course, all of the casualties that the Vervun primary forces had suffered in their ill-advised sally out against the Pharazoikans. Resources were already beginning to run a little bit dangerously low, and the ability to bring up further resources from the enormous, seemingly inexhaustible stores deep beneath the city of Vervunhive were being complicated by the fact that so much of the city's logistical infrastructure had been damaged or outright destroyed in the opening barrages. Even the Imperial Guard forces would be ill-affected by the logistical nightmare that Vervunhive was quickly becoming, as they were all deposited outside of the city and had to be transported over and into it across the Haas River. There were some major arteries still operational crossing the river, but a lot of Imperial Guard regiments needed to be moved over using barges and boats, even as the city was attempting to move some of the refugee hordes over into the outer Habs on the north shore of Vervunhive. An enormous and frankly somewhat hopeless affair, but it seemed better to at least shift some of the burden out of the hive rather than sit upon all of it. And even then, those trapped within Vervunhive, now struggling for access to food, medical personnel, and water, were a whole lot better off than the millions still outside the city. As after desperate struggles to keep the Pharazoikans away, the mass-fortified gates of the various fortress entrances to Vervunhive were closed shut and barred on the 6th day, with, again, as mentioned, millions upon millions of refugees still outside thronging for entrance. And unfortunately, they were about to get a lot of company, as millions of Pharazoikan troops, too, began to move into the outskirts of the Hive City's sprawl, and prepare their assault on Vervunhive, whose defenders were only now beginning to realize the full scale of what they were facing. And the introduction of additional Imperial Guard commanders would, at first at least, do little more than unfocus the defenders' efforts, as everyone had an idea of how to best defend Vervunhive and how best to bring Verghast back to Imperial compliance as quickly as possible. Especially as the true face of the enemy had yet to be revealed. After the disastrous defeat of the Vervun primary armored forces under the command of General Vagolan, the remnants of whose formation was only barely brought back into the safety of the Hive under the command of Commissar Pius cowl. The hive had now begun to hunker down. The shields had finally been activated after a mysterious period of hesitation on behalf of the High Master Salvador Sondar. And the hive's outer districts had in essence already been largely abandoned by the Vervun primary troops. In this unfortunate state, however, hope was beginning to manifest in the form of Imperial reinforcements under the command of General Noches Sturm of the Royal Volpon 50th. These Imperial forces were arriving expecting to find a local conflict, a so-called trade war. A common enough occurrence on the world of Vervunhive. But their opponent in this war, the hive city of Ferazoika, was mobilizing resources far beyond what the city should logically have been capable of doing, especially after its defeat in a previous trade war some 90 years ago. As the Vervun primary armored forces were not merely defeated, they were completely and utterly smashed by an overwhelming force, before which they were not even a speed bump. Upon their arrival, however, the experienced Imperial commanders, having seen more than enough of chaos in their careers, quickly grow suspicious of the true nature of their opposition. Picked captures of the battle that survived, along with Commissar Pius Cowl's testimony, would no doubt swiftly have established to the Imperial commanders that they were not facing some runaway Imperial hive, merely in this for some sort of trade concession or an economic victory, but something far more insidious. Even if they at the moment would have no real inkling of the true depths of Ferazoika's corruption. But an indication was on the way. For you see, the previous trade wars, of course, were just that. Trade wars, conflicts over resources, over economic position vis-a-vis the Imperium, over monopoly rights of a certain produce, and so on and so on. These trade wars had reasonable human motivations for the conflict, and were, in essence, trade by other means, I suppose you would say. But an enormous retina-searing flash, originating in the direction of one of Vervunhive's sister hives, Vanik Hive, heralded that this was going to be a very different sort of war indeed. Vanik Hive had of course been part of the alliance that had won the previous trade war, and was one of Vervunhive's closest friends, to the point where Vanik had dispatched 9 regiments of its own soldiers to defend Vervunhive. 9 regiments that may have been better used at home, as it turns out, as the entire hive simply disappears in a cataclysmic nuclear explosion. What exactly caused it is unclear. Perhaps the hive was infiltrated by Ferazoikan special operatives, who managed to make it all the way into the deep, dark depths of the hive, where they would have overloaded its titanic generators. Perhaps Vanik Hive's High Master had been corrupted via his link to Ferazoika. Or maybe it was simply destroyed in a single devastating shot from an enormous weapon. Pure speculation, of course, but I'm sure some of you who are already familiar with the historic documents may recognize what I am alluding to. Regardless of the precise cause, the fact remained that Vanik Hive no longer existed, and it took with it not only a potential source of military reinforcements for Vervunhive, but also the majority of its steady fuel oil supply. The Promethium pipelines between Vanik and Vervunhive had been filled to bursting, allowing the hive to greedily gorge itself on this precious resource in an attempt to fill its own bunkers and stores for the long conflict ahead, as fuel was going to become precious indeed. But with the fall of the hive and the now rather obvious implication that this was not a trade war but a war of extermination, extreme measures had to be taken. All of the Promethium pipelines connecting the two hives were ordered to be sealed and reinforced with permacrete blockages, so as to ensure that no surprises could possibly come from the ruins of Vanik Hive. And now, with the dispute as to the nature of the enemy so spectacularly settled, the Imperial Guard commanders and House Command could address more prosaic concerns, such as how the Hive was going to be defended in the first place. And very quickly, a clear divide in opinions emerged, with two prominent factions championed primarily by the Guard commanders. On the one hand, we had the commanders of the Rohan Deepers, the Armenian armored regiments, and Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt of the Tarnith First and Only, arguing that the best defense was a swift offense. The plan was for the Armenian armor, along with the northern colony's own tank elements, to sally forth from the southwest gate. They would then later be supported by Imperial Guard infantry and whatever elements of the Vervun primary forces could be relied upon to guard their backs. Once having successfully exited the gates, the Imperial Guard spearhead would then organize itself into battle lines and assault the Pharazoican forces directly in front of them, aiming to break through the Pharazoican lines, widen the penetration, and then eventually turn the majority of their armored force into the Pharazoican flanks, rolling up the entire advancing army. On the other hand, General Noxious Sturm of the Royal Volpin Bluebloods argued a far more conservative defensive approach. The bulk of the Imperial Guard infantry forces would take up positions alongside the Vervun primary defenders, and together hold the enormous, heavily armed and armored curtain walls against any Pharazoican attempts to capture them. The armor, meanwhile, would be kept in staging grounds deeper within the hive, protected by the shields and ready to deploy to any potential breaches, whether they be in the curtain walls themselves or, more likely, through the massive fortified gatehouses. One of which, Weaver Gate, had already been severely damaged in the preliminary bombardment before the shields were raised. The gate itself could not be closed, but was at least partially barred by a tremendous amount of rubble. It was even now being fortified and further blocked off by Vervun primary forces to make it as safe as it could be. The debate over which strategy to adopt, however, was cut short, as even whilst Gaunt and the other Imperial Guard commanders were at the forward curtain walls to survey the battlefield and determine the efficacy of their plan, they received notice that Noxious Sturm had gone over their heads and contacted House Command, and had already, through them, approved his own defensive plan. This outraged the Colonel Commissar and the other commanders, but, to be entirely honest with you, Their plan was lunacy. Let me elaborate. See, it is always difficult to accurately determine the size of Imperial Guard formations due to the simple fact that Games Workshop over the course of the last 30 years have never bothered to learn what the word regiment actually means. It is even more confusing here, as the Vervun primary forces operate with regiments commanding divisions. Spoiler alert, that's not how that works in any way whatsoever. But let us assume that the Imperial Guard regiments are indeed regiments. Alright, in that case, the combined total of the Narmenian armor regiments, assuming that all of them have the minimum quantity of crew to man a Lehman Russ main battle tank, further assuming that all the crew are used to man aforementioned vehicles, the total force of the Narmenian armor would be something along the lines of 2,250 tanks. Again, that is an exceedingly optimistic estimate, but let us assume that this is further matched by the Northern Colony's armored regiments. Let's add on a little bit extra just for charity's sake and say 5,000 armored vehicles. In addition to this comes the 6th Infantry Regiments, totaling some 20 to 30,000 men. Perhaps in the case of a reinforced regiment like the Tanith, the total might be 30 to 40,000. These forces would then have to exit through one of the primary Vervunhive gates. This procession alone would take somewhere along the lines of 2 to 3 hours, assuming parade-tight drill march formation, giving the Ferazoikan forces quite a bit of warning. Thereafter, the Imperial Guard forces would have to actually deploy in an attacking order before launching themselves at the Ferazoikans across unfavorable terrain. Again, the outskirts of the hive is, in essence, more mini-hive, enormous stretches of urban terrain that the Imperial Guard commanders were now proposing to launch armor through. But let's ignore the terrain difficulties for a moment, shall we, and assume that the Imperial Guard is able to deploy itself effectively and attack effectively through this terrain, in which case it would run headfirst into a Ferazoikan force numbering more than 20,000 vehicles and 1,000,000 men. Best case scenario, the Ferazoikans outnumber the Imperial Guard 4-1 in armor and 37-1 in infantry, and the Guard will be assaulting them. Even assuming the Ferazoikans made zero preparations for a counter-thrust and were caught completely and absolutely unaware, the Guard forces would need to achieve a kill ratio of 37-1 just to break even. And that is, of course, not counting the additional Ferazoikan forces still out in the grasslands. That is not counting the Ferazoikans' absolute annihilating superiority in field pieces of every caliber. Now, even if we assume that the Imperial Guard regiments of infantry are at least actually divisions, then that makes the odds look a pinch better at something along the lines of 130,000 men. Again, that's going to increase the time it takes to leave Vervunhive, but this still would improve their odds. They would still be outnumbered something along the lines of 10-1, but it is better. However, it, if only thing ever, actually worsens the greatest danger here, of course. This entire plan relies on the idea that this hilariously outnumbered Imperial Guard force will effectively break through a vastly numerically superior, zealous chaos enemy swiftly enough to turn and attack this force's flanks before the 1 million men they're fighting against can simply sweep behind the vastly outnumbered Imperial troops and cut them off from the only entranceway they have back into the Hive. And of course, if that happens, the only outcome is the complete and absolute utter annihilation of not just the full brunt of the Imperial Guard forces, but the majority of the northern colony's armor as well. And again, this is only taking into consideration the Phaerozoican forces that they had already observed in the opening battle where, I remind you, just such an armored thrust, albeit on a far smaller scale admittedly, and albeit in far superior terrain, was brushed aside like it was nothing. I can put it no other way than to say that this idea of a counteroffensive is very bad, and would require an absolute God Emperor granted miracle to be faced with any fate besides utter annihilation. For all the excessive starch in Sturm's meticulously maintained and immaculate uniform, he's got the right idea on this one. Even if he did go about implementing it in a slightly asshole-ish fashion. But hey, politicking is as much a part of the Imperial Guard's higher command structure as military endeavors is, and Sturm had realized the value of Commissar Pius Cowl, or as he was now known, the People's Hero, as he too had a keen grasp on the value of propaganda. Anywho, with the strategy for the defense of Vervunhive now finally settled upon, all that was left to do was to settle in and wait for the storm to break, which it did on the night of the 26th day of the siege. At this point, the defenders were well and truly prepared for it. They had had nearly a month to ready their defenses underneath the impregnable defense of their shield generators. And when the Phaerozoican bombardment lifted on the 25th day, everyone knew that this could only mean an attack was soon to come. All Vervun primary forces were brought to a full alert state, and the forces of the Imperial Guard also spread out across the city's defenses or in reserve positions where they could move quickly to counter any breaks in the curtain walls. No matter how unlikely such a scenario appeared, the enormous defenses of the Hive City were expected to stand up to virtually anything. The primary threat was likely to come from enemy scaling teams managing to make it all the way on to the top of the curtain walls. Thus, the Vervun primary forces, who were already masters of defending the walls, would make up the first line of defense. The Imperial Guard troops would be scattered in amongst the defenders, usually in platoon-sized formations. The heavy assault specialists of the Volpan Blue Bloods would form counter-attack teams, whereas the Rohan Deepers and the Tarnith would be scattered out to hold objectives. For example, the 3 Vervun primary regiments set to guard the Veve Gate was reinforced by 4 Tarnith platoons under the command of the regiment's second-in-command, Colonel Corm Corbeck, in addition to 2 Northern Colonies regiments as well. The only broad exception to this mixed order rule of Imperial Guard and PDF forces intermingling was the area of Vervun's Hive City walls known as the Spoil. This was an enormous area of, well, industrial waste, in essence. An entire enormous mountain that had grown so massive that it actually reached over the walls. This did not, however, mean that it was a weak point in the walls, for despite the fact that it did technically, theoretically present the attackers with a traversable, climbable surface, the incline was so steep, so treacherous, and so filled with razor-edged piece of industrial toxic waste that, frankly, the attackers might actually prefer climbing the sheer curtain walls instead. This area was defended exclusively by Vervun primary forces, known as the Spoilers, who were especially equipped and trained to operate safely and effectively in this rather unique environment. Although they would be joined by Tarnith first and only snipers and supporting teams during the conflict. The Vervunhive curtain walls were as heavily defended as they had ever been. And yet, in comparison to the enormous quantity of men and material that was about to hit it, it was woefully undermanned. As right around midnight, a massive general escalation assault was launched upon the walls by an unfathomable amount of Ferozoican armor and infantry. Whole divisions of armor and self-propelled guns rolled out from the now bombed out and ruined edges of what had once been the outer reaches of the Hive, and began firing de facto point blank up at maximum elevation against the curtain wall, attempting to engage first and foremost the wall guns, for the simple reason that the parapets were so far elevated that the tanks found it extraordinarily difficult to engage them effectively. Not that the wall guns were all that much easier targets either. Ensconced within meters-thick permacrete fortifications, las cannons, heavy bolters, and autocannons fired out from embrasures, laying into the advancing enemy hordes of infantry. Further up the walls, earth shakers and artillery guns also blasted out from their own protected firing slits, retreating back into the walls as soon as they'd fired, allowing meter-thick gun ports to slide into position to protect the weapons. The tanks were heavily outmatched, but the tanks also heavily outnumbered the wall guns. And seemingly for every armored vehicle blasted into smithereens and spinning shrapnel, another 3 moved up to take its place. And the infantry numbers were even more impressive. In the words of General Zank of the Northern Colonies, you could fire a lasgun on full auto from the top of the wall, killing dozens, and yet see the hole filled in the time it took to reload. The Ferozoican casualties would have measured in the thousands, if not tens of thousands per minute of this maddened assault. Any other army, save perhaps the greenskins or feared Tyranids, would have broken in minutes beneath such a butcher's barrage. But the Ferozoican Chaos forces marched on unperturbed, as if on parade. However, the mad zealotry of the assault did not seem to be doing the Ferozoicans much good. Their tanks were blasting the wall, but the massed ferrocrete fortifications were barely being chipped by the countless battle cannon shells hammering into them. The infantry standing below, pointlessly firing lasguns up against Imperial guardsmen 100 meters above them, might as well have been armed solely with harsh language for all the damage they were doing. There was a certain moral effect upon the defenders to see their enemies attack them in these mind-shaking numbers, but they appeared to present no true danger to the walls of Vervunhive just yet. Obviously, the more experienced commanders amongst the defenders knew that that was eventually going to change. And sure enough, after the enemy commanders had taken the measure of the defenders, they deployed motorized siege towers. Complex and monstrous machines tall enough to reach the very uppermost parapets of the enormous curtain walls. These ingenious engines of siegecraft began moving towards the curtain walls after midnight. Dozens upon dozens of them, presenting a clear and obviously immediate danger to the defenders. All fire was concentrated on them, attempting to bring them down before they could latch onto the walls, but not all could be destroyed. The very first motorized siege tower to hit the walls happened at Haas West Fortress. There was an initial moment of relief as the defenders realized that the tower was too short to reach the top of the wall. Right before, the siege tower began to telescope upwards, having been designed to be able to strike at the wall regardless of its altitude in that region. Once it reached the height of the actual wall itself, several ingenious weapon systems atop it activated, including rocket launchers, flamethrowers, and grenade launchers, sweeping the ramparts free before the huge assault ramp clanged down, crushing parts of the fortification beneath its weight, and hundreds and thousands of Pharozoican troops began streaming out of it. The seemingly ancient contraption was proving effective, and only after desperate counterattacks and several rocket launchers being fired straight down the gullet of the open assault ramp was the tower destroyed, and the Pharozoicans attacking Haas West repelled. But that was, of course, not the only siege tower advancing upon the defenders. A further 3 assaulted Sondar Gate. One was intercepted and destroyed by the massed wall batteries. Another reached the wall, but it had picked its spot particularly poorly, and as it began to elevate its fighting platform, it did so right in front of the muzzle of an Earthshaker gun. The crew of the mighty weapon fired at point-blank range into the siege tower. The blowback blast damaged the gun and severely injured the crew, but succeeded in neutralizing the tower. But the third engine reached the gate, clamped on, and successfully elevated to deploy its troops directly into the gatehouse itself. The idea was almost certainly for the Pharozoicans to assault the gatehouse and open the gate controls, allowing the uncountable thousands of Pharozoican soldiers and tanks underneath to flood into Vervunhive. And they very nearly succeeded. Just as they had done at Haas West, the siege tower weaponry cleared the parapets, allowing the Pharozoican troops to assault into the gatehouse, wiping out almost all of the Vervun primary troops stationed there. But before they could reach the gate controls themselves, Colonel Corday of the Volpan Bluebloods led a ferocious counterattack at the head of his contingent of heavy infantry. Their resplendent uniforms streaming back into the fortress even as the Pharozoicans were storming into it. It was 2 seemingly unstoppable forces crushing against each other. Over 1,000 Volpan Bluebloods, including the elite 10th Company, were thrown into the fight for Sondar Gate, and only after hours of the bloodiest fighting of the entire conflict up until that point was the siege tower attacked, destroyed, and the Pharozoicans repelled. Only now did the enemy's preparations finally begin to wither on the vine. Another siege tower east of Sondar Gate, just where the wall curved towards Vever, managed to reach the walls but had taken enough damage in the approach to see its extension mechanisms jam, causing the siege tower to stand there ineffectively, unable to elevate either its weapons or its fighting platform to the point where it could assault the wall. That tower would remain there until the end of the conflict, where it would eventually be taken down by controlled demolition charges. And the last two towers assaulted Haas West. One of these was destroyed by the wall guns, and the other reached the wall but was destroyed swiftly. The defenders of Haas West had the benefit of having heard communiques about the other siege towers, and Colonel Commissar Gaunt, stationed at the fortress, brought all of his men into cover, saving them from the sweeping fire from the siege tower's pintle mounts. Then, the moment they stopped firing, he led an immediate charge directly towards and into the tower, catching the Pharazoikans by surprise by the shock of their assault. It would of course merely be a matter of minutes before the Tarnith would be overwhelmed by the thousands pressing up on the stairs and in the elevators within the siege tower, but minutes the Pharazoikans did not have. Gaining control over the topmost assault ramps, the Colonel Commissar ordered his men to drop satchel charges straight down the gullet of the siege tower. Barely escaping in time, explosions rippled up through the tower, gutting it from the inside and rendering it worthless to the foe. But even that was not the end. Clearly, the siege towers had been intended to secure the tops of the curtain walls, and if possible, secure the gate fortresses for a general invasion of the entire hive. But even though the siege towers failed, the follow-up was still coming, having been intended to secure and expand upon any breachheads made or taken on the walls 5 spider engines. Enormous mechanical monstrosities capable of scaling the walls, using their viciously hooked feet to rend and rip apart the permacrete, pulling themselves up bodily, even as they also use hefty wires and siege hooks to shoot up at the walls and pull themselves up simultaneously as they climbed. Under the cover of their own incessant fire from cannons and point defense weaponry, the spiders approached the walls. It was immediately obvious to the Imperial commanders that these were an even greater threat than the siege towers, and immediately all available wall guns were directed towards them. 2 were destroyed or crippled before they could even reach the walls. 3 got to them and began to climb up the walls. If they reached the top, their weaponry would gut the defenders and might allow for further scaling parties to follow. Never mind that no one knew what might be inside of their bodies. There might be thousands of assault specialists gathering within the spiders. Another one of the monstrous machines was destroyed by the Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat, by Commissar Verkane, who rolled munitions down from the top of the wall directly down onto the climbing war machine, blowing it clear off the wall and taking a serious portion of the curtain wall along with it. There would be a need for some serious maintenance work after the war, but it was better to make sure there was an after the wall first. Another spider attempted to make it through the broken Vewe gate, clawing its way through the rubble and pushing its way over and past barricades, pushing apart the improvised defenses that the Imperial Guard and engineers had worked so hard to erect. and the hindrances that would have proven impossible to pass for any number of enemy tanks was overcome by the spider. But its triumph was short-lived. The moment its form emerged from the gate, it was faced with massed North Colony armor, who blasted it with dozens of high-explosive and armor-piercing impact hits, sending secondary explosions tearing through its hull, popping open hatches and seeing the machine slump dead, further blocking the Vaver gate. Mass armor would be the solution to the last spider as well. It was climbing the wall west of Harswest Fort. It managed, unlike its brethren, to reach the top of the wall, where it predictably routed the defenders with flamethrowers and point defense weaponry, causing enormous casualties. But as it hauled its bloated form onto the flat of the wall, beginning to look around for opportunities to sweep a greater surface area clear of defenders, General Grisman's Armenian armor, massed in an open plaza behind the wall, finally got a clear shot. And yet again, dozens upon dozens of heavy cannon sent shells arcing towards the monster, shooting it straight off the curtain wall. And with the final war machine's end, the first so-called storm came to a close. Ferozoika had attempted a massed general escalade. The first wave of infantry and armor was intended to shock, surprise, and overwhelm the defenders, hammering fire down upon them to suppress the wall defenders and demoralize the infantry on top of the walls. This should have paved the way for the siege towers to close in and create beachheads on top of the walls, beachheads that could then be swiftly exploited by the spiders, intended to climb up the pre-cleared areas and then descend down into the hive city below, causing havoc and mayhem wherever they went. This, in turn, would have bought enough time for the gates to be opened and Ferozoican armor to pour through, deploying itself without getting bottlenecked by an immediate Imperial response, and in turn, then, the moment a critical quantity of armor and infantry had passed beyond the gates, they could simply roll forward in an unstoppable tide of mechanized death and destruction. It was as fine an offensive siege plan as anyone could ever truly concoct. If any one of the three primary thrusts of the plan had succeeded, the entirety of it would probably have succeeded in turn. Even the final gambit, the spiders themselves could potentially have cleared enough wall defenses for climbing apparatuses and telescopic ladders to be brought up to secure the tops of the walls. It would have taken a very long time and been far less effective, and would have been extraordinarily susceptible to counterattacks, of course, but even the last and the final element of the plan had the potential to sweep the walls. But in any attack upon a massed enemy fortification like this, no plan is ever going to be 100% guaranteed to succeed. And the efforts of the Tarnith First and Only, directed by the Colonel Commissar personally to destroy one of the siege towers, and the massed sacrifice and efforts of the Blue Bloods to destroy another, had seen the second and most pivotal and vital element of the plan fall short. The siege towers had not managed to create a single permanent hold on the walls, and the one toehold they had gained had been thwarted by the Blue Bloods' willingness to place their own assault experts up against the cream of the enemy's crops. And even when two of the spider war machines technically created breaches at Wever Gate and by climbing over the wall, Notch's Sturm's plan of redundancies and defense in depth saw ample armored reserves ready to crush them. Once again, for all of Notch Sturm's perceived imperfections and later failings, his plan had worked out to perfection and had allowed Vervunhive to survive the first major storm. But the defenders were rattled too. The Ferozoikans had assaulted them with a simple disregard for death. Not even merely a disregard, perhaps, but a desire for it. They had attacked and attacked and attacked. No amount of fire, no amount of wall guns, no amount of heavy bolters, autocannons, las gunners, or earth shakers could halt them. It is very difficult indeed for any mortal man, no matter how well trained or disciplined, to stand up to an enemy such as that. And worse still, the Vervunhive defenders had not dealt by any stretch of the imagination a crippling blow to the enemy. They had slain hundreds of thousands, and yet the enemy had retreated in good order. And none of the defenders could possibly fool themselves that they had seen the worst of this war. And to further complicate matters, Imperial command was beginning to bicker yet again. Weaknesses had been revealed in the Vervun primary defenders. Their organizational structure was simply not set up for fighting a war effectively on this scale. There were still too many checks and balances in place, and the Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat exercised too much power on the fighting troops. Orders were not getting through as quickly as they should. The communication systems was on the verge of being overloaded, making communication between various units challenging at best, difficult most of the time, and downright impossible occasionally. There were many failings here that could potentially turn into major disadvantages, or even crippling weaknesses for the defenders. These were weak spots that in peacetime could be fixed. Slowly and painfully, but they could be fixed. In wartime, however, even beginning to try and organize a solution to problems that affected so many units on such a deep-rooted and systemic level as basic communication, it would be folly to even try. And so workarounds were created amongst Imperial commanders instead. Workarounds that might be viewed as insubordinate by some, especially as these workarounds were not even attempted to be cleared through official channels. Furthermore, the Vervun primary officers, although many of them had proven themselves to be courageous and efficient, also demonstrated a general lack of large-scale war experience, especially under such trying circumstances, and they were not meshing particularly well with the Imperial Guard, both due to the usual friction between natives and off-worlders, and also due to the fact that the Vervun Primary viewed this as their war first and foremost, and that the Imperial Guard were practically intruding upon their turf and trying to take command away from them. And, well, there was some truth in those allegations, fostering an unfortunate us versus them mentality, which was then further complicated by the command structure of the Hive itself, and the Vervunhive Primary Hive Commissariat, whose toes were being most thoroughly stepped on by the off-world commissars and their commanders. And to add yet another layer of complications on top of all of this, of course, there was the complicated political situation of the Hive itself to consider. Its High Master, Salvador Sondar's position was not firm, and there were many that were considering moving against him, but in a crisis like these, there were no real opportunities. Furthermore, the crisis itself also offered its own opportunities for potential advancement, both political and more immediately economic. And there were also those with other goals in mind, such as the people's hero, Commissar Cowell, who wanted off this rock and saw the war as an excellent opportunity to re-establish his bona fides with the new Imperial Crusade command. An ambition complicated quite severely by the presence, of course, of Ibrahim Gaunt, the very man who had Cowell exiled to Vervunhive in the first place. And then there's the friction between the Tarnith and the Blue Bloods and so on and so on. Remember when I said that an Imperial High Commander needs to be a politician as much as a general? Well, I am revising that statement to say that they'd probably stand to gain from focusing about 75% of their attention on the politics. Still, blissfully unaware of all of this nonsense, the morale of the average Lasman was still quite high. They had resisted the first storm with fairly minimalistic damage. They'd taken casualties, of course, and the occasional wall gun here and there had been damaged or knocked out, and the wall had seen better days, but the defenses in their eyes were in no danger whatsoever from crumbling, and they had exacted a dire toll on the attackers, whose casualties must number in the hundreds of thousands at the very least, and probably millions. The one bright side was that this fanatical determination on the behalf of the attacker had blown away any hint of doubt as to the nature of the opposition, and so calls for further Imperial reinforcements had been put out. And already confirmation had been received that major Imperial reinforcements had been redirected to Verghast. All the defenders had to do was hold out and survive the second storm, which was even now beginning to brew out in the wasteland. Heritor Asphodel was not about to make the same mistake twice. He had expected the enemy defenders to be poorly organized and demoralized. A vast enough show of force should have been enough to send them scattering, and if that did not achieve the desired objective, then surely unloading thousands of troops directly onto the walls via the enormous motorized siege towers would put the enemy to flight. And were it not for the intervention of the Imperial Guard, this might very well have been the case. At the very least, one or two major penetration of the defences would have been achieved. And thereafter, the moment the Pharazoikans were on the walls and were assaulting the gatehouses from atop them, it would probably have been pretty much over for the defenders, as unfathomable amounts of reinforcements could have flooded into the city the moment a gatehouse was seized. Instead, his demonstrative escalation had been repulsed, and so the heritor had to come up with a cleverer plan to inherit this particular imperial city. And come up with one he did. And it would include some of his favorite toys. And even as he was preparing, the Imperial defenders were doing the same, attempting to work out the kinks in their communication systems, and a few commanders even took measures somewhat in their own hands as well. One particularly interesting example of this came at Veve Gate. The command of the Vervun primary forces, as well as the Tarnith First and Only, and the North Call elements during the first storm had been far from perfect. And now the combined forces of the defenders had been placed under the command of Colonel Modil of the Vervunhive primary, an inexperienced field commander, placed in a position of authority over probably the single most obvious target along the entire wall of Vervunhive. If there was anywhere the defenders could be damned certain the enemy would strike, it was at Veve Gate. One can obviously understand why experienced field commanders, knowing for an absolute certainty that they were smack dab in the middle of the way of a major enemy offensive, might be quite nervous about the prospect of facing that enemy under an inexperienced commander. And so Colonel Korbeck of the Tarnith First and Only and Colonel Bulwar of the North Colony's armoured and infantry regiments had agreed on a secret Vox message. Anvil. When and if either party sent this message over the Vox network, they would bypass the official lines of communications, and instead the Tarnith and the North Call elements would begin organizing and communicating with each other directly, without the Vervunhive primary forces. Again, one can see why they might do this, but it has some obvious dangers. And before a better solution could be generally implemented, the second storm began to strike. The first sign of it was a saturation bombardment, no longer at the shields, but the wall itself. Up until this point, the enemy had appeared content to simply hammer away at the shields, on the off chance that they might theoretically be able to overload them if they poured enough firepower into them. And the enemy certainly had no shortage of shells, so they might as well try. However, having failed to produce any results now, even after weeks of effective and consistent heavy bombardment, they now changed up tactics and began attacking the wall. Now, the wall itself, being made up of dozens of meters of reinforced permacrete, was not going to break or buckle to any substantial degree, virtually regardless of the period of time the enemy spent bombarding the wall. And furthermore, if the enemy's artillery guns were now close enough to be firing directly at the wall, instead of lobbing their shells up in the air to get extended range and falling down upon it, that also meant that the majority of the enemy's batteries were in range of the wall's defenses. A major risk, which was taken in order to pour fire onto the parapets and the gun ports of the wall in order to suppress the defenders and make it difficult for them to engage the approaching Phaerozoican forces. Furthermore, the covering fire would make it far more difficult for the Vervunhive defenders to accurately observe the movements of the heritor's armies. A valuable and deliberate addition, as this would not be a general demonstration and escalation like the first storm. Rather, this was intended as a far more directed surgical strike, with only a small number of objectives. The first being Sondar Gate, where the majority of the enemy's armor and super heavies attempted to batter down the very gate itself. This was in all due likelihood not a truly serious attempt, as the gates of a hive city are, not easy to breach, no matter the quantity of firepower you bring to bear, unless you could somehow bring a naval weapon down to the surface of a planet, you're not going to be getting through them anytime soon. However, the deployment of massed super heavies and the heavier armor available to the attackers indicated that their real intention here was not actually to cause a breakthrough, but rather to weather the enemy's fire as effectively as possible, thereby drawing Vervunhive reserves to Sondar Gate in the fear of a breakthrough that the enemy wasn't necessarily really planning on. The heritor had next to endless reserves. The Vervunhivers did not, and so every gun, every man, every tank that could be redirected to Sondar Gate was one that wasn't going to be facing off against the two more important objectives. This exchange of fire would continue on for 2 more hours, until the diversionary attempt had drawn out as many Vervunhive forces as it could, and eventually began petering out thereafter. The second assault force headed towards Crow Gate. This one as well seemingly did not have the intent to overwhelm the defenders. Instead, it engaged the wall defenders in a running skirmish fight, where the Pharazoikans would assault the walls with their guns and then fall back into the broken hinterlands, then attack somewhere else and continuously do so. They were testing the defences for weaknesses, seeing if any part of the wall had been abandoned, or if a section had been unmanned enough to send reinforcements to Sondar Gate, that a rapid escalation might have a hope of a quick victory. The Pharazoikan hopes, however, were dashed, as whatever shortcomings Hive Command may have possessed did not extend to demobilizing their troops in sufficient numbers to allow the enemy any decisive local advantage. The occasional attempt was also made in the direction of the spoil heap, but were thwarted quite easily, and some far-ranging scouting forces were peeking at the edges of the citadel walls as well, towards the river Haas. But the river itself, deep and fast-flowing and overseen by massed wall guns, did not prove to be the weakness that the Pharazoikans may have hoped for. Largely, however, this second move was also a distraction, as the main effort was, as everyone had anticipated, focused towards Veiver Gate. This saw the enemy's first deployment of their super heavy walkers, nicknamed Flat Crabs by the defenders. These enormous creatures, easily the size of a super heavy tank, were bristling with both close and long-range guns. But first and foremost, they were heavy assault platforms, with a frankly ludicrous amount of protection, and following behind them were massed batteries of assault guns and self-propelled artillery cannons. These all focused in on the wall guns surrounding Veiver Gate, and at now, in essence, point-blank range in artillery terms, they no longer contented themselves merely with suppressing the defenders. They were bracketing and targeting one gun at a time, ensuring, through sheer quantity of firepower, that the permacrete cracked, broke, and shattered until the guns themselves were exposed and destroyed by overwhelming firepower. This required a remarkable degree of discipline and direct control from the Pharazoikan forces, as they designated one weapon to be destroyed at a time, even as their own batteries were suffering heavy casualties. Unsurprisingly, self-propelled artillery cannons are not designed to be dueling with wall batteries at point-blank range, and their casualties must have been enormous. But as there were 10 attackers for every defending gun, the sheer, unyielding math of war saw the Pharazoikans triumphant. and the way leading up to Vervunhive Gate, previously swept by earthshakers, autocannons, heavy bolters, and rocket batteries, was now clear for the enemy to approach, led by their flat crabs. Of course, the gate itself was still blocked by enormous quantities of rubble and, well, the carcass of a couple of siege spiders from earlier. The Imperial defenders and their engineers had done their best to mine it and make it as impassable as they could, but before the siege crabs there was, nothing much they could do. The guns blasted apart any obstacles that its enormous legs could not simply just crawl over. And so the siege crabs began to move into Vervunhive Gate, where the crabs could do their real jobs. Enormously heavily armored from the front, the countless tank shells that the North Col armored regiments poured into them seemed to do very little, if anything at all. The first crab was only destroyed when a Vervunhive primary major, one Racine, ran towards one with a bag of explosives. The major was killed right before reaching his target by Pharozoican infantry flooding in after the tanks, but not having noticed what the major was carrying, the flat crab made the mistake of simply continuing on, crushing the major and a massive sack of high explosives underneath it. The skyrocketing fireball was of such ferocity it flipped the flat crab on its back, allowing the North Col armored regiments to destroy it, as its abdomen was predictably less armored than its frontage. A second crab would eventually be destroyed by simple massed cannon fire, pummeling its armor until simple structural stress caused them to break open and the vehicle to be destroyed. But by that time, the crabs had achieved their purpose. These enormous assault guns had engaged the North Col armor, keeping them busy and destroying dozens of them, allowing the Pharozoican infantry to begin flooding in around them and engaging the infantry defenders. It also allowed an opportunity for Pharozoican engineers to begin blasting away the rubble and the obstacles, leaving new routes open for tanks to begin rolling into the Hive city. Reinforcements were obviously and desperately needed, but with the various poking and prodding efforts made by the Pharozoicans, it was difficult to get authorization to move troops over to Vervunhive Gate. One of the first major columns to start moving were the Armenian armored regiments under the command of General Grismond, who mobilized his armored vehicles away from Sondar Gate as it became apparent that the enemy was not going to breach it, and attempted to rush towards Vervunhive Gate, but due to failing communications yet again, as everybody was screaming, everybody was panicking, and everybody was reporting attacks all along the wall, they were stuck in a gridlock. They were not given effective instructions as to how to reach their objective. They were simply told to continue making their way towards it, even though all of the routes they were designated to carry on through were completely gridlocked. Taking things into his own hands, General Grismond ordered his tanks off the main road arteries and into industrial districts nearby, ordering the tanks to lower dozer blades and simply start ramming through the structures in their way whenever they needed to. This caused quite a bit of havoc, of course, through an industrial district. And the tank column was stopped, not by the enemy, but by Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat troops, who of course were engaged in the unenviable task of attempting to control all of these thousands of Vervun primary troops, all of the guardsmen, all of the logistical systems, and the continuing gridlocks. Their orders were simple: to move the armor along the designated routes. They themselves have no authority over actually designating those routes. They were following orders and attempting to get everybody moving as effectively as they knew how to do. And here was a mass of Imperial armor running through some of the Hive's most important industrial districts, causing God only knows how much damage. And in their eyes, ruining their homes and ruining their economic base, which they would need to rebuild the Hive, still assuming, of course, that they would be a Hive after the war. Meanwhile, equally understandably frustrated, General Grismond was looking down at these Hivers with no idea how to wage war, standing in his way, telling him that he couldn't move through an unoccupied industrial district and get to the actual fighting because they didn't have their paperwork in order. Things escalated very quickly indeed, with both sides yelling at one another. The Commissariat was staring down a column of tanks. Meanwhile, the Narmenians could literally see the flashes from Vervunhive gates where their allies were being killed by enemy super heavy assault guns. Shouting turned to threats, threats turned to the Commissar placing his hand on his gun and unholstering it, causing General Grismond to strike him and disarm him. Which the Commissariat troopers did not take very well at all. Pulling their own weapons and essentially escalating the entire conflict to the point where either the two sides started shooting at one another or the Narmenians surrendered. Colonel Grismond, understanding that this had gone way too far already, chose the latter. And to be clear here, the Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat is a commissariat force. They are subject to the authority of Imperial commissars, yes, but they are nevertheless commissars. And I don't know how to put this other than you do not hit a commissar regardless of what he does. And don't get me wrong, the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat are absolutely guilty of being obstructivist shitheads here, valuing paper far more than actual battlefield conditions. But this remains utterly and completely irrelevant. You do what the Commissar says, and you complain about it later. That is the only way this works. And that is the only way this was going to work here as well. As now, after having explored the alternative possibility of striking the Commissar, not only is the Narmenian armor still not going anywhere and not getting any closer to reinforcing their Imperial Guard comrades, in fact it's getting further away, as now the armor is stuck permanently and without a commander. Yes, the situation was not handled well by either party. And to add in an extra dash of confusion, at Vervunhive Gate, Colonel Modiel's Vervun Primary Forces were struggling to resist the mass of Ferozoican troops who were flooding in through the broken gate and over the wrecked flat crabs. It became undoubtedly obvious that the Colonel was simply not up to organizing the complexities of a battlefront so intense and so entangled as this. He ordered his men to do things which they themselves already on the ground could see was impossible. Or at the very least, they deemed them to be impossible. And instead of accepting that on-the-ground assessment, Colonel Modiel would frequently engage in arguments with his troops, trying to get them to do what he wanted them to do. And to be fair here, the Vervunhive troopers were hardly any more experienced than their colonel, so a lot of this argumentation was doubtlessly in error on both parties. But a commanding officer, and certainly not a colonel, should never be arguing with his men. The very fact that he had to, or felt that he needed to try and convince them to do anything, was already a major command failing. And to obfuscate the situation yet further, of course, the Tarnith and the North Call elements had already agreed between themselves, as we mentioned earlier, that this colonel was a danger and not to be listened to. This made their formations even more difficult for the colonel to command, and made them, well, near inherently resistant towards his orders. And then the code word Anvil was given. After that point, the Tarnith First and Only troopers in the North Colony armor and infantry regiments were no longer merely resistant of the colonel's orders, they had cut him out of their command net entirely, and would even start taking command over Vervunhive primary forces that they found milling about without adequate instructions. By virtually every definition in the book, this was a mutiny, with the Tarnith and the North Call having completely separated themselves from the normal and ordered system of command. And as they had shut off their own connections to the Vervunhive primary headquarters, they could not get any instructions, even if Colonel Modiel had any to give, nor could Colonel Modiel gain any good information from the Tarnith or the North Call. And surprise, surprise, rendering the colonel deaf and blind to the actions of 2/3 of his forces did not enhance his command capabilities. The front at Vevea Gate was thus on the verge of collapse. The Ferezoikans were pouring in by the thousands. The reinforcements were stuck in the gridlock, with the most important element in Armenian armor, of course, being permanently halted. The situation was only saved from the brink of complete catastrophe by the intervention of the people's hero, Commissar Pius Cowley, whom, the moment he'd heard the fighting begin, had turned around and headed out from the central command spire, grabbing any and all troops he could along the way. Vervunhive primary troopers, Imperial guardsmen, it didn't matter, and with sheer force of personality, he reversed the traffic jams, turning troops, vehicles, and equipment around and back towards Vevea Gate, where he arrived at the head of this mass of men driven near solely by his own force of personality and righteous zeal. Throwing this pell-mell force in against the Ferezoikans, it provided enough of an impetus for the remainder of the defenders to rally around and begin routing the Ferezoikans back towards the gate, digging them out of the positions they had only barely started to form themselves to protect what they viewed as their most promising bridgehead. Say what you want about the Commissar, but on this day at least, he truly did earn the title People's Hero, as if he had been even an hour or two later, Vevea Gate may very well have fallen completely, and with no actual organized reinforcements on the way, it would have been up to the troops already there, already in a dangerously disorganized state, to somehow organize a counterattack to drive the Ferezoikans out of positions that they were even now beginning to dig themselves into. It would have been an extreme long-shot situation. But, due in large part, near exclusively in fact, to the People's Hero's intervention, the second storm was also weathered, and Vevea Gate was reclaimed. But one disaster narrowly averted was followed by another that Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt straight up walked into. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt arrived at Vevea Gate along with additional reinforcements. These were troops that the Colonel Commissar had ordered to dismount from their transports and continue on towards Vevea Gate on foot. They arrived too late to take part in any of the fighting. However, the Colonel Commissar had been attempting to contact Colonel Modiel's communications bunker at the front line and had failed to do so. both due to the, well, hive-wide communications failure and the general overload of the Vox network, and in part due to Colonel Modiel's frustration with his forces not obeying his commands. He had ordered some of the communications equipment shut down, some of it for repair or scrutiny to see if it was even functional. The Colonel Commissar thus headed directly to the command post, where he found Colonel Modiel in not a very good state, and neither were his officers. It was pretty clear that things had not gone as they should have had here. And so, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt ordered all of the personnel in the command bunker to surrender themselves into his authority. Furthermore, he would also seize all of the Vox communications equipment and look over the logs as well to see what he could untangle from this. Colonel Modiel objected quite vehemently, at which point the Colonel Commissar snapped. He was evidently in an incredibly foul mood, as described by the personnel within the communications bunker thereafter, and supposedly said something about too many, including Commissar Cowell, viewing him as soft. And shortly after stating this, he pulled out his service weapon and summarily executed Colonel Modiel. Now, I have oft argued that on occasion, the sledgehammer should win out over the scalpel. There are scenarios in which a demonstration of force and authority is a far more effective tool than any quantity of subtlety or cautious correction. But this was not it. The Colonel Commissar executed, outright, without a trial, a higher-ranking Allied force, PDF equivalent officer, in his first combat engagement, with zero investigation for failing to maintain communications and provide orders during an engagement where a hive-wide Vox failure was in effect, where parts of the Colonel's forces had actively and deliberately cut themselves off from his communications network and were acting independently of his command. And most damning of all, the testimony that he had said that some considered him too soft before he carried out the summary execution. This appeared, for all the world, as if an Imperial Commissar had killed a PDF officer for no better reason than because he was having a bad day. This was, without question, an exceptional failure of judgment on behalf of Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt. And whilst he was within his right to do this, the obvious consequences of such an action were not long in waiting. As shortly thereafter, being summoned to Hive Command, the Colonel Commissar elected to further compound his error, as he made an impassioned speech defending his actions to House Command by stating emphatically that the chain of command must be observed at all time, and any who breaks it must do so knowing they risk the highest penalty. To which Commissar Pius Cowell, of course, asked, "So, all who transgress must be punished?" To which Gaunt responded, "Of course." See, in the Colonel Commissar's mind, he was sure that Pius Cowell was simply desperate to get off-world, and a good word from Gaunt might just about do that, as it was his word that got him sent here in the first place. What the Colonel Commissar failed to consider was that he was no longer the War Master's favorite, and that thus the people's hero seeking his approval of all people would seem rather weird. Worse still, Ibrahim Gaunt had not kept up with communications traffic. You know, the crime he executed the colonel for? Otherwise, he may have known that General Grismond had been arrested precisely for violating the chain of command, which the Colonel Commissar had just stated emphatically was absolute, and everyone who violated it must be punished. I'd like to say that Cowell somehow manipulated the Colonel Commissar here, but he really didn't. He really did not. And so, when Gaunt, of course, then demanded the release of General Grismond, he set an obvious double standard for House Command, that there was one rule for the Vervunhive primary forces, whom the Colonel Commissar clearly felt completely justified in executing out of hand with zero investigation, and the Imperial Guard forces, whom he now defended vehemently and demanded be released, also without investigation. If anything, if you really wanted to see what Commissar Pius Cowell could have done, imagine what would have happened if he'd snapped up the code word Anvil, traded between the Tarnith and the North Col elements right before they cut communication to Colonel Modiel and began organizing with each other. The Commissar would have been well within his right to demand that Ibrahim Gaunt execute his own colonel, as well as the commander of the North Col forces, based on Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's own goddamn testimony. Aye. To put it rather mildly, Ibrahim Gaunt had placed himself, make no mistake, in a very complicated position, where, again, to be fair, General Grismond and the Narmenian armor were of pivotal importance to the war effort, and placing him on trial, with a potential execution hanging over his head for striking a VPHC officer, was mildly ridiculous, with the fate of the Hive hanging in the balance. But of course, the simple courtesy of giving him a trial was already far more than Gaunt had given to the Vervunhive primary, and so he had no position to argue from. He had no legal standpoint other than to pull rank, which is exactly what he did, arguing again correctly that the ranking Imperial Commissar, that being Ibrahim Gaunt, had the ability to block any efforts on behalf of local law enforcement to prosecute a Imperial Guard officer, even if the charges laid out against aforementioned officer were exactly the charges that Gaunt had just confirmed. This, needless to say, did not help relationship with Hive Command much, as they now reasonably felt like second-class citizens in defense of their own hive. So yeah, things could be going better, but hey, they'd survived the second assault, hadn't they? Surely there'd now be a nice little pause before anything worse happened, right? Right. Even as the Imperial headquarters staff were busy attempting to tear each other's throat out, largely thanks to the Colonel Commissar, every single loudspeaker in the city and every single loudspeaker outside the city as well, in the Pharazoican lines, began blaring out the same name at maximum volume. Heritor Asphodel. Heritor Asphodel. Again and again and again. as the Chaos Forces launched a mass jamming attack on all frequencies. Well, I say jamming, as that was certainly the effect they achieved, but it was also largely a moral attack and a declaration that the heritor himself had reached the front line. And the third storm was going to be by far the worst of all. You see, whilst both the Imperial commanders and Hive Command had assumed that the second storm was just that, a major massed assault, and it would take the enemy time to organize for another one, well, it turns out that the second storm was essentially just a massive reconnaissance by fire, where the Vervunhive moved to see if they could secure any significant advantages before launching an all-out mass escalade upon the entirety of the wall, whilst also blanketing out the Defenders' Vox network. The Defenders' communication systems had, as we've addressed on multiple occasions, not really been particularly effective at the best of times. Now, however, it went from merely not very functional to absolutely and utterly paralyzed, leaving the high and mighty commanders in the central hive deaf, dumb, blind, and, perhaps worst of all, mute. In order to attempt to assert some sort of control over the situation, Marshal Crow immediately departed the central spire to head towards Sondar Gate, where he hoped to take direct command of the defenders and begin to communicate his decisions to lead the defense of the hive via runners, or whatever form of archaic communication system he could establish. There was still a hope that the hard lines running throughout the wall would be intact enough to relay messages to the various portions of the defenses, even though the sheer scale of the enemy's assault appeared to make defense frankly somewhat pointless. The Vervunhive were attacking all along the wall, in numbers rivaling those of the first storm, in terms of both armor and super heavies, though this time the enemy also brought another weapon to bear, a far more subtle one. Haas East Fortress had so far been the quietest part of the front line. It had seen some fighting, sure, but it had not been the focal point of major enemy action. This was about to change, however, as the fort commander looked out over the battlefield in the direction of Ontabi Gate, just in time to see the gate explode, and to then subsequently watch the curtain wall also begin to explode, sending pieces of debris the size of battle tanks flying outwards into the hive, as the wall all the way between Ontabi Gate and 2 Haas East Fort began to collapse, even bringing down a substantial portion of the fortress itself. And most disturbingly of all, the explosions had not come from without, they had come from within. Vervunhive infiltrators and commando parties had managed to make their way into the wall, into the gate, and plant countless explosive charges, all whilst presumably defeating the defenders who were unable to call for aid, either due to the suddenness and the ferociousness of the attack, or due yet again to the absolute paralyzation of the communication systems. It immediately became a question where these invaders had arrived from. It was later apparent that they had arrived through the massive promethium pipes that connected Vervunhive to Vanik Hive, the dead hive that had disappeared in a nuclear explosion. As we talked about previously, the moment this happened, of course, House Command ordered all connections to Vanik Hive severed and closed off with permacrete blockers. But there were those amongst the mercantile class of Vervunhive whom, upon seeing, of course, the massively inflated price of promethium, decided to keep the pump lines open, so as to fill their own promethium bunkers to overflowing. I'm sure the profit margin of all that free promethium must have been extraordinary, but all the profit in the world tends to be of very little use if there is nobody left alive to spend it. And it was looking highly questionable whether or not anyone in the hive would survive the day, much less so the coming years. And incidentally, the merchant who was responsible for this egregious security breach was discovered after the war. Traces of him anyways. Suffice to say, he did not live to enjoy his ill-gotten gains. But the sabotage was already a fact, of course, and the Pharozoican Third Storm was breaking against the curtain wall up and down the entirety of its length. In many areas, the defenders were already in danger of being overrun, or were still already overrun. It was no longer a question of if the enemy would breach the wall, but when and in what kind of numbers. Ironically, the area of the wall that was doing the best at the moment was the area where there was no wall, the enormous spoil heap, known only as the spoils, which ran out over and through the curtain walls, was actually doing a better job of preventing the enemy's infiltration than the surrounding strongpoints, due to the incredibly difficult and harsh nature of attempting to ascend the spoil heap, offering plentiful, semi-natural challenges, and on top of that, of course, were the spoilers. Specially trained and equipped Vervunhive primary defenders whose duty it was to deny any and all infiltration of the city via the spoil heap. With their training and equipment, they were making the advance exceptionally difficult for the Pharozoicans, and with the support of further specialists from the Tarnith First and Only, most valuably scout snipers with high-powered long-last weapons, well, the spoil was looking like it might just be the last place to fall. Cold comfort for everybody else, of course, but hey, it was something, wasn't it? But the bad news were not done just yet. Just as Marshal Crow finally arrived at Sondar Gate, he heard a loud atmospheric pop and a crack high above as the towering shield generators, extending an umbrella of safety across the entire hive, shut down. And with them, of course, went the shield as well. It was not overloaded, it was not destroyed, it was actively disabled. The Pharozoican gunners, of course, accepted the invitation for exactly what it was, and redoubled their bombardment of the wall, the hive, and all transit routes leading out from the central hive, and all Imperial Guard marshalling yards as well. Exactly the same sort of pattern that they had laid down on the city in the early days of the war, when they were attempting to paralyze the defenders and destroy them in their barracks. Well, the Pharozoicans would get a second chance of doing just that, at an even more pivotal moment. Back then, the wall was still fully supplied, fully manned. Even without the forces of the Imperial Guard, there was a decent chance that the defenders might at the very least have survived the first storm and the initial escalades. But now, the wall had already seen off enemy attacks. It was dangerously undermanned. Forces had been pulled back to rest and reorganize, assuming that there would be no further mass assaults. Worse still, the wall had not yet been fully resupplied, with guns and ammunition. The logistical system of the Hive was beyond overloaded. It wasn't merely just moving troops back and forth, a significant enough challenge for a Hive under siege, with only so many arteries capable of transporting the huge quantities of men, but it was materiel. The wall had taken a devastating pounding. Weapons would need to be unearthed from ancient arsenals. Cannons, las weapons, heavy bolters and autocannons all needed to be brought from central depots to the wall, where they could replace destroyed wall guns. Furthermore, additional repair kits to try and patch up the wall's insides and repair rents or beginning cracks was also required. All of this equipment and specialized gear would choke arterial roadways for hours. Next on the list of priorities were the actual ammunition for these weapons, high-explosive warheads, anti-tank grenades, power packs for las cannons, and the millions upon millions of rounds of autocannon and heavy bolter shells. Only after that again came the equipment and the supplies for the average Imperial guardsman, charge packs for las guns, and rations. Many of the units currently fighting at the front line had virtually exhausted their existing supplies during the second storm, and due to other things having a higher priority, had largely been incapable of resupplying themselves. And now, both those supplies and any additional Imperial guardsmen that could be scared up from their barracks and thrown towards the wall were being intercepted by a massive curtain wall of enemy high-explosive shells, pelting transports with shrapnel and blowing gaping holes in the permacrete highways. You'd almost think that the Hive and its command would be accustomed to catastrophe by now. But, accustomed or not, some drastic measures needed to be taken quickly. First and foremost, the shield needed to be reactivated. Holding the curtain wall was, well, frankly pointless if there was no Hive left to actually defend. Marshal Crow briefly considered turning around and heading back up to the Hive, but seeing the inferno that was beginning to play out on the way there, he realized that without a wall, there also wouldn't be a Hive, and so he would stay. Instead, however, he would dispatch his adjutant, and he gave him his most prized possession, the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar, the current master's illustrious forebearer, and symbol of command of the Hive. He instructed his adjutant to keep the sword at least safe, and to pass it on to the next man in command of the Hive, which would in all likelihood be Vice Marshal Anko. Well, more on that in a moment or two, as the Marshal himself had no expectation of surviving the battle at Sondar Gate, and if by some miracle he did, well, he could always ask to have his sword back. But most importantly of all was that the adjutant was to immediately lead a contingent of bodyguards and whatever military personnel he could scrunch up within the Hive Spire itself up to Salvador Sondar's personal abode and take command of the shield, one way or another, as the damage was only growing every minute the shield was down. Already in the opening barrage, General Zank, leading a massed column of North Call armor moving to reinforce the defenses, was obliterated. The whole column plus its commander in mere moments. The armor was of course moving in march order, all of their hatches open and unbuttoned, and no more than a meter or two separated each tank as they made the most of the limited space on the highways. Once the shield failed without any forewarning, and the first shells began hammering down amongst them virtually seconds later, there was no time to react. The explosions alone were dangerous, the shrapnel too, but the overpressure of that many massive high-explosive grenades slamming down all around them would have killed or injured most of the crew of a tank. Then the other tanks would just be sitting there, hemmed in by the now uncrewed carcasses of armored vehicles in front of them and armored vehicles behind them as far as the eye could see. And sooner or later, with the sheer volume of incoming fire, there would be direct hits. Now, one HE shell impacting on a tank might not be enough to destroy it. It might not even be enough to kill the crew inside with modern defensive measures. But if the hatches are open... Oh yes, and one shell is one shell. 2, 3, 4, etc. Yes. Even the mighty Lehman Russ will not survive that kind of a beating for very long. All of this was, of course, also more than apparent back at Hive Command. All strategic movement within the Hive had, in essence, been brought to a complete halt. The Hive had been paralyzed. Orders could not be given, instructions could not be issued, and data could not be gathered efficiently from the front line. The only thing that House Command knew was that the Hive was on its last leg. It was dying, and its defenders along with it, and there appeared to be very little anyone could do. The stress of that realization would test the toughest of individuals, and unfortunately, Vice Marshal Anko was not amongst the most resilient servants of the Golden Throne. And so, with a room full of people screaming at him for instructions, with a mass of icons on his planning table flashing at him either for orders or because they were about to be destroyed, Vice Marshal Anko did what seemed to him the most reasonable thing at the time. He unholstered his sidearm, executed his planning table, and then moved on to the House Command staff and personnel, catching as many of them as he could with rounds as they all thronged to get out the command center's single exit. Whether or not he was intending to save the last round for himself or not, we will never know, as shortly after he began his rampage, a missile slammed into House Command and blew it and everyone inside of it straight out of the side of the Hive. It was now truly every man for himself, as each Imperial Guard unit fought its own isolated war against the unending mass of Pharazoican invaders. All they could do was wage the war in front of them, and hope that other forces would do the same to their flanks and rear. One of the first positions to begin to falter was to be Sondar Gate. It had evidently been designated as a primary and major objective by the Pharazoican forces. Presumably, previous attempts upon the gates, which had been close to a success, had marked it out as relatively weak, particularly in comparison to its position of tremendous strategic import. The Hieronymo Sondar Gate was one of the single largest remaining ingress points into the city, and gave access to the Square of Marshals just beyond it, a massive open space where the Pharazoican forces could mass for offensives on the rest of the city. The seizure of Sondar Gate, therefore, was clearly a key objective of the invader. And to make sure that they could seize it this time, they deployed yet another innovative and weird piece of siege technology, another one of the Heritor's woe engines, a creature described as praying mantis in shape. A siege tower, in essence, moved up to the gate, shrugging off the now rather desultory barrage that the wall guns could put up in an attempt to hinder its approach. Whereupon its two offensive limbs, its praying mantis arms, slammed down onto the gate fortress, affixing the entire enormous machine firmly to the gate and its gate fortress, allowing Pharazoikans to stream up into the praying mantis and directly onto the battlements. Numbers, yet again, were the attackers' primary weapon, and they began to overwhelm the bastion. The Vervunhive primary troopers offered brave and stubborn resistance, but when Marshal Crow, who had been leading the defensive efforts, was swept from the top of the wall and sent flying down onto the rubble below, the defenders took a near-mortal blow to both morale and command structure. Miraculously, Marshal Crow actually survived the fall, although he was crippled in doing so. He lay there, body broken, far down below the battlements, and stared up as thousands of Pharazoican troops stormed into it and started torching it, clearing it room by room with explosives and flamers. Until, at long last, the Marshal's life was ended by some random Pharazoican foot trooper, who probably had no idea that he'd just mercy killed the supreme commander of Vervunhive. But the Pharazoican planned to stream into the field of marshals and then use it as an enormous, marshalling ground to launch attacks upon the rest of the city were frustrated by a formation of Tarnith First and Only troopers under the command of Sergeant Bray. Him and his men, some 300 soldiers in total, had been resting in billets in the Anko chemical plants areas beyond the Square of Marshals. Once the shield faltered, however, Sergeant Bray acted quicker and smarter than most. Instead of waiting for any instructions, and none would ever come, he realized that he was sitting in an area that was prime billeting ground for troops that were in reserve to defend the wall defenders, and he also knew that the enemy would know that just as well as he did. Getting his men out of their bunks as swiftly as possible, he ordered them to move into the vast refuse and spoil heaps beyond his billeting locations. Enormous labyrinths of industrial waste, of refuse, of garbage. Virtually unmapped and uncharted even by the locals, the area had been used as a refugee ground of sort for those more unfortunate after the Great Escape from the Outer Hive. Many who didn't have official citizenship or registration, or who were simply worried that they might be taken advantage of, either by the Vervunhive primary police forces, the commissariat, or their fellow refugees, had fled into this wild, untamed area where people could go to ground and remain hidden for very long indeed. It also proved to be an excellent defensive area, where Bray and his 300 managed to hold off a near-regiment strength force of Pharazoikans, as the enemy's superiority in armor benefited them not at all in this rugged terrain. A mini spoil heap. Just like the wall was holding out so effectively, this also allowed the Tarnith to play to their greatest strengths of concealment, hit-and-run tactics, and their efficiency as light infantry. Even when the Pharazoikans managed to get lighter, smaller, more mobile and nimble vehicles into the area, they were easily outmaneuvered and destroyed by Tarnith tank hunting teams using shoulder-mounted anti-tank launchers. This delay to the Pharazoikans' ability to begin to pour into the hive proper and beginning to spread through it would prove crucial later on. And the Tarnith had other achievements that day as well. the force under the command of Major Rawn and a Volpan blue-bled Colonel, Corday, were holding Veve Gate against all comers, with the enemy's war machines having provided a better barricade than the Imperial Guard engineers could ever mount. The ruined and obstructed gate was now a perfect choke point and bottleneck. The Ferozoikans could only funnel so many troops through it at a time, and as they began spreading into the area beyond and around the gate, they would be attacked by the Tarnith, playing to their strengths as light infantry. They could launch blistering attacks upon the Ferozoikans, causing far more casualties than their limited numbers and light equipment would suggest, before falling back as rapidly as they had arrived. And when the Ferozoikans then moved to pursue what appeared to be a fleeing light enemy foe, the Tarnith would run right on back into the Volpan Blue Bloods, who would then counterattack the pursuers, smashing them apart by playing to their strength as heavy infantry. It was remarkable, really. The Blue Bloods and the Tarnith had no love for one another, and Colonel Corday himself, although he had put on an act of behaving cordially towards the Tarnith, secretly despised them, and would happily sacrifice them if it meant he could spare his own Blue Bloods. But due to the ferocious necessity of simply just surviving through the day, the two forces melded together remarkably well, and managed to maintain resistance even when most of the other areas of the front line had already collapsed. In fact, 6 hours into the third storm, the primary threat to Major Rawn's Tarnith and Corday's Volpan were not the enemy in front of them, but instead the Ferozoikans moving through Sondar Gate, who were now in a position to begin outflanking and cutting off the brave defenders of Veve. Luckily for the defenders, Tarnith reinforcements that had been hurrying on foot from their own billets under the command of the Tarnith second-in-command, Colonel Colm Corbeck, arrived just in time to interpose themselves between the Ferozoikans and the vulnerable flanks and rears of the Veve defenders, who, due to again the complete collapse of communications, had no idea they were about to be encircled. But the truly decisive action of the third storm did not actually take place on the battlefield at all. Instead, it happened deep beneath the main hive spire. As we mentioned a while ago, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was heading down into the bowels of the spire to interrupt an official court-martial being held by Commissar Pius Cowell and the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat against General Grismond of the Narmenian Armor. He had with him an advocate, an expert in Imperial law, and he was soon thereafter to be joined by the Volpan General Noches Sturm, along with his bodyguard. You see, before leaving the spire, Marshal Crow had ordered Sturm to head down and get an end to the court-martial because, well, no matter how correct it might be, the Hive was on the edge of defeat, and it could not afford to waste one of its best armored commanders right now. Gaunt did not know about this until he saw Noxious Sturm and his Blue Bloods joining him. He was skeptical at first, but Sturm reassured him that they had a shared purpose today. And he was fortunate that he arrived too, because Commissar Cowell was not about to hand over his authority over this court-martial. Apparently, the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat had not heard all of the nonsense going on outside, and the discussion grew rapidly more heated until the shooting started. And coming out on top, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt and his newfound Volpan friends killed the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat officers and captured Commissar Pius Cowell, freeing General Grismond and ordering him immediately to ascend up the spire and take command over his armored regiments, who were apparently just standing idly by without their commander. What? Were they on some sort of protest or something? Ridiculous. Anywho, Cowell was brought along, as he was now going to be brought up on his own case of a court-martial for crime committed against Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, I suppose. Whom, to be fair, had more important things to worry about just then and there. He'd freed Grismond, but now he'd also been informed that the shields were down. Busy day for the Colonel Commissar, busy day indeed. He ordered Sturm to return to the command center, whilst he grabbed the Blue Blood bodyguards to lead them up Spire to find Salvador Sondar and inquire, rather pointedly, no doubt, as to why the shields were downed. Upon arriving at Sondar's private quarters, they discovered the remnants of Marshal Crow's adjutant and his own bodyguard who had attempted to break into Sondar's private abode and turn the shields back on. But they had been intercepted by his flesh puppets, whom he had now apparently armed. He'd also created quite the monstrous behemoth of various body parts that he'd sewn together for shits and giggles. This disgusting perversion of the human form killed several more of the bodyguards, both of the adjutant, who expired, and the Volpan Blue Bloods. And it damn near killed Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt as well. You see, the thing had acid for blood. And so when the Colonel Commissar struck it with his beloved chainsword, a gift from his mentor Delane Oktar, he wounded the beast, to be sure, but it also destroyed his primary weapon, and were about to destroy him as well, were it not for the actions of Commissar Pius Cowley, whom, after having been freed by Gaunt, understanding that, yep, we are going to need all hands on deck now, leapt onto the beast and shoved crack grenades down its throat. Not appreciating its new diet, it bit down, tearing both of the Commissar's arms off. But a few moments thereafter, the crack grenades detonated, blowing the creature to smithereens. And I would think killing everybody in the room, considering its acid-like blood, but miraculously, no one was apparently affected by that. Authorial forgetfulness aside, Commissar Pius Cowley died, with his rank pins attached after Gaunt returned them to him, recognizing the bravery of his sacrifice. A noble gesture on the Colonel Commissar's behalf, especially as Cowell had just enough life in him to spit out a little venom at the Colonel Commissar. Well-deserved venom, mind you, as he pointed out that Gaunt was too soft for this business. He wasn't too soft to execute Salvador Sondar, however, who had by now turned into a bloated, distended monstrosity hanging within his Vita chamber. He'd been ripening for quite some time. Sondar had apparently been corrupted via the communications channels open between him and Ferozoica Hive, where, of course, heritor Asphodel had taken control quite some time ago. It is testament to the distance between the two that he had not grown corrupted quite enough to become a full-scale puppet of the heritor. This might also shed some light as to why Vanik Hive disappeared so suddenly. It may be that Asphodel had been working his influence on quite a few High Masters all across the planet, and he had simply turned out to be more effective with the High Master of Vanik than of Vervunhive. With the High Master now dead, the shields could be reignited with the authorization that Marshal Crow's adjutant had brought with him. And as the shield bubble once again began to extend across the hive, miraculously the hive had not taken enough damage to seriously incapacitate it or destroy its pylons. Thank the God Emperor. Strategic movement within the hive was now finally possible again, and the bombardment of the Pharozoican artillery was stopped, allowing the Imperial Guard defenders, who had now been seriously exhausted, and in many cases pushed beyond the wall, to fight at least on an equal footing with the enemy attackers. Though, make no mistake, the situation was still desperate. The enemy had gained access to the hive, and was streaming right past the curtain walls, as both Crow and Untabi gates also had to be surrendered to the enemy. Vervun primary forces were withdrawing in decent order, even if they had virtually no command and control capabilities left, supported primarily by the Rohan Deepers battalions, who were able to provide expert leaderships from their Imperial Guard officers. The two forces meshed reasonably well together considering the circumstances, and the majority of the troops were able to extricate themselves without being annihilated. Crucially as well, Haas West Fort was still in the hands of the defenders. Some 5,000 Vervun primary troops were holding it and fighting bravely for every inch, even as tens of thousands of Pharozoicans launched themselves at it and began blowing holes in its defenders and infiltrating the insides of the fortress. This was a crucial linchpin in the Imperial defenses. If it fell, then the eastern side of the hive would be laid bare, and enormous amounts of Imperial troops could be circumnavigated around the city landing fields, which would also give the Pharozoicans access to the main spine itself. Captain Kargin, the commander of Haas West Fort, knew this, and so inspired his men to fight on with remarkable determination and stubbornness. Though it might just be a question of time before they were overwhelmed, as supplies began to be a real problem yet again. In fact, it was the supply situation and its ever-worsening state that eventually forced Major Orn and Colonel Cordoy of the Volpin and the Tarnith to withdraw from Veve Gate. They were able to receive at least some resupply from Colm Corbek's forces who had moved up to support them, but they too they'd been withdrawn to rest and reorganize themselves, and had only been able to grab whatever they could out the door, in essence, before rushing off to help their brethren. And whilst now that the enemy bombardment had at least ceased, you'd think that supplies could begin to flow again, but the roadways were still pockmarked with countless explosive craters. The roadways were hardly fitting to move much of anything, really, without significant effort. Worse still, the Pharozoicans had infiltrated past the Imperial Guard in many locations, as they were now in essence fighting a desperate, scattered guerrilla war against the invaders. There were entire battalions and companies of Pharozoicans that had simply moved through the gaps in the Imperial lines without even knowing that was what they were doing, making the transportation of supplies and reinforcements even more hazardous. Something remarkable needed to happen, and it needed to happen soon, and without central command and control, that was an impossibility. Fortunately, there was still one Imperial Guard commander in the main hive spire, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt. He was now the hive's ranking Imperial officer on station. You might be wondering what happened to General Notcher Sturm? Well, he'd figured the battle was pretty much lost, and had attempted to flee on a shuttle. Gaunt clapped him in irons, unsurprisingly. And as for General Grismond, well, within the Imperial Guard, armored commanders are always subservient to Imperial Guard infantry commanders. It might just be one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, but details. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was therefore the only man for the job, and more importantly, the only one in a position to actually seize the job. He was handed the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar by Marshal Crow's adjutant as a sign of the fact that he was now supreme commander of Vervunhive. Rushing to reorganize whatever he could of a command staff and getting communication system back up and running again, he slowly began to reassert central command and control over the scattered Imperial Guard forces, being forced to start from the very ground up by contacting individual commanders to figure out where the hell their troops are and what, if anything, was in front of them. One by one, he extended his situational awareness until he was able to mount an organized defense. Fortunately, again, with the shield overhead, the enemy's primary offensive advantage, their artillery, was neutralized, and their second offensive advantage, their armor, was severely hampered by the highly unfavorable environment it found itself in. It doesn't really matter how many tanks you have if every road is a narrow-ass street and all of the highways have already been blown up by your own artillery. You're not going to get very far without infantry support. And the infantry were getting absolutely slaughtered by dug-in defenders every inch they advanced. Ironically, the awful communication systems that had caused the defenders so much grief were now actually working to their advantage. Since all the defenders had no real idea what was going on, they were simply engaging whatever was in front of them. As they didn't know any better, they would simply dig in, resist, and only withdraw when absolutely forced to do so. And most crucially of all, General Notcher Sturm, before attempting to escape, had also issued a general retreat order. A retreat to where? That's a very good question. As, of course, as we have seen many times, the only retreat path would be, the River Harse? An enormous, super-wide, rapid-flowing river with only a handful of connections and some ferries. Yeah. You weren't getting a whole lot of anything across there safely, especially not with the Pharazoikans closing in. But Notcher Sturm was not exactly in his best mind at the moment. Indeed, when he was relieved of command and arrested for desertion, again, rightly so, he requested the honor of taking his own life. The Colonel Commissar decided to honor this request and handed him a loaded sidearm, which Notches immediately turned on the Commissar. Only Gaunt's distrust of the general and his own quick reaction, plus the keen edge of his newly found power sword, saved his life and severed the general's hand from his wrist. Well, that at least was one battle that Gaunt wouldn't have to fight again, as he refocused his efforts on, well, simply surviving the next few hours. In the center of the war front, Sergeant Bray, and anybody he could find, honestly, Vervunhive Primary, Imperial Guard, Rowan Deeper, Scratch Company, civilians, whatever he could get his hands on, was slowly falling back towards the Hive's interior. Their main objective now was to dig down and protect the vital shield pylons. If those were captured or destroyed by the Pharazoikans, then that would truly be the end of it, as Pharazoikan artillery could yet again begin supporting their infantry and armor. Bray also had a far more squishy cargo to guard as well. Hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of civilians were now beginning to throng out of the workers' hives and into the main spine of the spire and the Commercia districts. They were all attempting to get to the docks on the northern end of the city, They were hoping to be able to cross across the river either on ferries or via the road bridge or the viaduct channel and the railway connection, attempting to get to safety to the manufactorums on the other side. There were far too many people, again, for these limited points of egress to ever be able to evacuate them in time, but in times of tremendous distress, people tend to simply move and hope, rather than surrender to the inevitability of hopelessness. And there were bright points as well. The enormous tear in the curtain wall between Crow Gate and Ontabe Gate Fortress, which had been torn open by the Pharozoican infiltrators, had been pouring armor en masse into the hive. It had become the enemy's main entrance into the hive proper. And it would be a wound that would continue to bleed unless something could plug it. But there were no Imperial Guard forces capable of engaging the enemy in what would in essence be an enormous, relatively open-pitched battle. Not, that is, until General Grismund and his Narmenian armor was on the field. Back under the command of their general, mounted in his personal battle tank, Grace of the Throne, the Narmenians led further north core elements and formed up the spearhead of the mechanized and armored counter-thrust. This finally allowed the Narmenian armor to really shine, as they engaged enemy armored columns that outnumbered them many times over. The Narmenians would send half of their forces barreling through the enemy columns, firing at max speed as they did so, as the Narmenians valued their driver skills above anything else, trusting in their gunners' expertise and the excellent stabilization mechanisms on their tank guns to keep them on target. This first wave of Narmenian armor would pass through the enemy column, causing chaos and distress before shooting out the other side. The enemy commander, now finally beginning to realize what was happening, would then turn his weapons against the force that were just leaving. At this point, the Lehman Russers would turn around, and the second wave of Narmenian armor would then begin their assault on the same side of the column that the Narmenian armor had just passed through, catching the enemy column in a scissor between both forces of Narmenian armor. This would of course also place the Narmenian tanks themselves in one another's firing lines, but this was a well-trained elite regiment, and Grismund was rightfully proud of the fact that he had never once, whilst carrying out this maneuver, lost a single vehicle to friendly fire. Vervunhive would prove no different. And whilst the North Corps armor were engaging the enemy in a far more standard slugfest duel, the Armenians rushed up and down the enormous gaping hole in the hive's flanks, destroying column after column after column, racking up a truly amazing kill count, and thus near single-handedly stopped the bleeding from the western side of the city and protected the millions of refugees flooding down towards the docks. So long as the Armenians had enough fuel, ammunition, and stamina, it looked like they would be able to keep this breach sealed. The Colonel Commissar in the main spire probably finally drew a breath of relief at this, as the front lines were beginning to slowly stabilize. Countless scratch companies, formed from various hive workers, were joining up with the Vervunhive primary defenders. Some of the best ones had already made quite the name for themselves, like one encountered by Colonel Bulwar during fierce fighting. This scratch company was some 700 strong, a significant force even if it was made up of eager amateurs, armed with whatever they could get their hands on, from grenades to melter charges to mining tools like simple picks and close-range heat cutters. This scratch company was under the command of General Orgun Sorek, who had fashioned himself his own rank pins, thank you very much. Upon meeting with Colonel Bolvar, however, he was instead issued with the brevet rank of sergeant, as there were frankly too many generals in the Hive, and most of them had proven not that useful, honestly. These various scrapped companies were slowly but surely integrated into the overall plan and registered within the Hive, where the Colonel Commissar was desperately reinforcing, well, anything and everything with anything and everything. At this point, the primary reason why the Hive defenders were not overwhelmed was because the enemy had still not fully broken through the spoil, and those areas that they had seized, like Sondar Gate and Veyver Gate, were, well, still bottlenecks. Veyver Gate was massively obstructed. Sondar Gate had taken an absolute pounding itself, and could even at the best of times only accommodate so many troops moving through it. And now that the breach between Crow and Ontabi Gate Fortress had also been largely plugged, the stream of enemy reinforcements was finally beginning to slow. Having established a relatively solid line of defense, the Colonel Commissar withdrew for the night to bang one of the local nobles. I'm not even joking. This actually led the Colonel Commissar to being asleep when the single most important change in the battlefront occurred. You see, the garrison at Haas West Fort was still, remarkably enough, continuing to resist. It maintained the flank of the Imperial Guard positions, and played a pivotal part in why the Imperial Guard defenders were still around at all. But its garrison had been severely reduced. Captain Kargin, the fortress commander, now had no more than 600 men left, most of whom were armed with nothing more than their personal sidearms or lasguns. All of the fort's artillery guns had either been destroyed or ran out of ammunition, as had practically all of its heavy weaponry. The men that were left now were, well, more of a hindrance than a true danger to the onrushing attackers, plinking away at them from firing slits. The captain ascended to one of the highest points in the fort to get a decent view of what was out there in front of him, and to communicate his situation probably one last time to Spire Command. That is when he saw a behemoth vehicle out in no man's land. A vast pyramid-like construct apparently grinding slowly towards the fortress on dozens of enormously wide caterpillar tracks. And couched in the middle of this vast spike was a cannon the size of his entire fortress. He hurriedly reported whatever he could to Spire Command, namely that there was something out there, it was really goddamn large, and he could hold out at best for another hour. That was spoken about 30 seconds before Haas West Fortress was simply wiped off the map as a goddamn naval weapon fired upon Haas West Fortress. Somehow, heritor Asphodel had managed to not only scavenge a lance battery cannon, but had brought it down to the surface of the planet and built an armored casing around it. A casing capable of moving, albeit tortuously slowly. This thing was dubbed simply the Spike by what remained of Spire Command, and Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, after being roused from his carnal indulgences, was informed of the destruction of Haas West Fort and the approach of what must be the enemy command center, not only because of its sheer ridiculous size, but also because it was the central point of all of the enemy's communications efforts, including their attempts at jamming Imperial Guard communications by constantly spewing forth the name heritor Asphodel. The Colonel Commissar was also informed that the Hive was now completely surrounded, as those poor unfortunate civilians that had managed to evacuate to the northern shore and the manufactorums, well, they were even now being slaughtered by Ferozoican mechanized forces that were rushing up the northern shores. There would be no escape from Vervunhive, and the railway bridge, the viaduct, and any connection to the northern shore were either being destroyed by the Ferozoicans themselves in their retarded eagerness to get to the Hive, or blown up by the defenders so as to not allow mechanized spearheads to stab them in the back. But despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation, the Colonel Commissar had a plan. You see, his coital activities had gained him more than a mild risk at STDs. He'd also been granted a secret weapon by House Crow's young and voluptuous heiress. Apparently, the house had kept a rather devious little secret in its vaults, a piece of archaeotech, a system slayer. In essence, a hyper-powerful virus on a USB stick, or the 40k equivalent. It had been crafted in case the Hive itself ever fell to tyranny, a tyranny as defined by whomever held the key, I'm sure, and would be used against the Hive to take care of aforementioned tyrant. But being a piece of archaeotech, the thing was unimaginably powerful. It could probably hack into and destroy virtually any system it could interface with, and, well, the enemy's central command and coordination system, along with their by far greatest weapon, was right now standing on the rubbled edges of the eastern side of the Hive, blaring out its commander's name. It doesn't take a genius to see what the next step in this saga should be. Although, getting there and actually carrying it out would still be quite the challenge. And so, Operation Hieronimo was created, after the Hive's original savior. It would call for a small, highly elite unit to infiltrate towards the spike, then get inside of it and introduce the System Slayer to its own internal workings, which would hopefully bring it and all of the Ferozoican command and control systems to a complete stop. Hopefully, it might even spread to their other pieces of war gear. Best case scenario, it would completely cripple the enemy, and even in the worst case, merely taking out the enemy's supreme command might just buy the Hive enough time for the War Master's reinforcements to arrive. It was a daring mission and a last chancer style operation that would be conducted by the cream of the crop of the Tarnith Regiment alongside specialists from the Volpin Blue Bloods under the command of Colonel Gilbert himself. The two regiments sure have come quite the way from enmity to combined operations. This crack troop would further be led in by Scratch Company specialists who had experience operating behind the Ferozoican lines. This would obviously be made up of their best specialist individuals as well, under the command of their hero, Gol Collier. His story too is both a long, complex, and tragic one. On more than one level, mind you. But We will get to that much later, as his wife was killed during the opening barrage of the war, and he believed that his two children that were with her at the time, Darlin and Yonsi, had also died with their mother. However, they had in reality been picked up by a young Hive ganger girl, of all people, by the name of Tuna Creed. She had decided to bring the children from the bombed-out transit hub where their mother had died, and to protect them. She managed to get them into the hive and near the Anko chemical plant, where they were hiding in the slag heaps along with many other refugees. She'd even broken into the Tarnith's first and only billets to steal supplies, where she was almost killed by Trooper Durman Kaffron. But Tona had the high fortune of being attractive. Which meant that Kaffron, instead of shooting her, instead sought her out later on to feed her and her two charges. And all four of them would in the end survive the siege. But we're wandering somewhat off topic here. Our little crack team began their journey towards the Great Spike surprisingly easily. Apparently, the Pharaohs didn't think that anyone would be dumb enough to approach their spike, and so the Tarniths began climbing up the side of it. Which I feel like would have left them remarkably exposed and easy to detect by any sort of surveillance system or even accompanying troops, but details. Finding no ingress point, however, the Tarniths began to wonder how they were to get inside, when the Blue Blood Colonel suggested that maybe they just march down the main weapons barrel. It was certainly large enough. And hey, if it fired whilst they were inside, they'd never know about it. As fine a plan as any suggested at the time, and so it was hastily and eagerly adopted. Fortunately for our heroes, the enormous naval weapon could not be fired continuously, and had a nice long cooldown period before the devastating beam could yet again lash out from the construct to cut deep into Vervunhive. The infiltrators ran into resistance quite early on, but clearly the Pharaohs had not imagined that anyone would ever be so silly as to not only climb onto their ginormous weapon spike, but then infiltrate down its primary weapon either. And so the crack team made it to the command bridge relatively unscathed. And most crucially, with the system destroyer intact as well. The moment it was allowed to interface with the spike was in essence the moment when the Pharaohs army ceased to be an army and became an armed rabble. And not a second too early either. The Narmenian armor that had been staunching the bleed on the western side of Vervunhive, between Ontabe Gate and Crow Gate, were just about overwhelmed. They had destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of enemy armor pieces, but flat crabs and further woe machines were driving them deeper and deeper into a corner, pushing them up until the edges of the Commercia, where all the civilians were sheltering. The shield pylons were now under direct attack from hordes of Pharaohs, which were pouring through the Tarnith and the Vervunhive primary defense lines just outside of it. The worker habs were, for all intents and purposes, fully conquered. Even the main spine was in the process of being infiltrated then and there, and the civilians, huddled together in the Commercia, could hear small arms fire now. Even as the Pharaohs mechanized forces on the northern side of the river, no doubt were getting ready to start building pontoon bridges or sending across amphibious vehicles to slaughter the survivors. But all was not won just yet, as whilst the command bridge itself was surprisingly barren, there was a large chamber in the center. A chamber that now began opening, revealing the colossal form of heritor Asphodel in his full armor set. He killed 2 infiltrators in as many seconds, and would no doubt have gone on to slaughter the entire infiltration party, were it not for the fact that heritor Asphodel was surprised by this, as everybody else was. He began attacking his assailants immediately, but he clearly had not had enough time to fully analyze the situation, and so when he turned his enormous bolt pistol upon the Imperial Guard commissar rushing towards him, he failed to notice quickly enough that he was not wielding some chain sword, but a master-crafted power sword, which pierced straight through Heritor's armor and speared through his heart just as his finger twitched on the trigger, sending an enormous explosive bolt straight into the commissar's heart as well. The 2 would have died there together right then and there, had it not been for a exquisitely crafted metal rose that the Colonel Commissar had been gifted by the nobles of House Crow, who apparently grew gardens of metallic flowers. And I think the descendants of House Crow should give thanks every day to the God Emperor that aforementioned garden was destroyed in the battle. Otherwise, they would have wished they had perished with their hive. Anywho, the metal rose deflected and stopped the bolt shell enough to allow the commissar's beaten, bruised, bloodied, and unconscious form to be carried from the command spike and to safety. A miracle in and of itself. And another was playing out in Vervunhive. Without the constant chatter of the spike to keep all of the Chaos forces organized, they broke down completely. Many of the Verzoikans not only lost the will to fight, some even lost the will to live, wandering onto the enemy's guns or simply ending their own existences. Others appeared to have been under some sort of spell, and now released attempted to return back to Verzoika. Yet others still went to ground to offer ferocious resistance against the defenders who needed to winkle them out of their hidey holes weeks and weeks later. But all organized offensive actions were simply impossible for the Verzoikans. The Armenian armor was able to rally, drive off the flat crabs that now seemed incapable of mounting real resistance, and the infantry too shattered and scattered away from the defenders. It would be quite some time before the Imperial defenders were truly ready to take up an active pursuit, but once they were, they did so with a vengeance. Any and all means of transportation were acquired and used as troop carriers to launch Imperial Guard and Vervunhive primary forces out beyond the city and into the grasslands to hunt down the Verzoikans. By the time the Imperial reinforcements arrived some 12-odd days later, the battle had already been over for the majority of that time. Nevertheless, the War Master unleashed 6 million guardsmen on the world below, plus forces from 3 Astartes chapter, because Verzoika could not be allowed to continue to exist. The taint that had entered that now condemned hive had to be stamped out with absolute merciless prejudice. And it was. The hive itself being destroyed by point-blank range low-orbit bombardment. But it was not to be the only hive destroyed. Vervunhive 2 was, for all intents and purposes, shattered. The casualties were such that it would be impossible to restore the hive to functioning order, and even keeping it livable would be far more trouble than it was truly worth. The hive's population would be scattered out to the northern colonies and the other hives. 2 new hives would eventually be founded, but it would take centuries, millennia, before they would even become to rival the shadow of Vervunhive. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was a victory, and life, no matter how dark and harsh, is still life. Though many of the survivors wondered what they had to live for. Makaroth issued a decree stating that any surviving Vervunhivers who wished to do so could join up with the Imperial Guard, and many did so, especially the Tarnith First and Only, the heroic regiment that had saved their hive, such as it was. And Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt became the new People's Hero. A more permanent one this time, as Commissar Pius Cowl, although his name would be remembered with due honor, had a somewhat complicated legacy attached to it now. Thus, the Tarnith First and Only would leave the world of Verghast stronger than they had found it. And that was a good thing, as they too had suffered serious casualties during the siege. And with the new reinforcements, they were finally brought up to their old strength again, though a lot of adjustments were going to be needed. The Tarnith First and Only had been just that, the Tarnith First and Only. But now they were a mixed regiment, with people of a completely different culture living and fighting alongside them. They needed to adopt new officers, and weirdest of all, the Tarnith First and Only would now become a mixed regiment, as many of the survivors from the scratch companies who had fought alongside the Vervunhive primary defenders were women. Now this has obvious complications, and indeed, disciplinary action would grow ever more necessary shortly after the merger, because whilst a woman with an assault rifle can kill a man just as easily as a man with an assault rifle can, the moment you introduce a stock of females to several thousand men who haven't seen one in months, stowed together on troop transport ships, well, I hardly need elaborate, do I? There were also some more almost consequences of the siege as well. One of which, for example, were cries heard amongst some of the upper echelons of Imperial command to reward Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's inspired defense of Vervunhive with a command position in the Imperial Guard. And hey, he had certainly demonstrated an aptitude for the position. Very few commanders could have pulled the defences together as rapidly and as effectively as the Colonel Commissar did. However, there were a tremendous number of complications with such requests and voices. First and foremost, the simple fact that the current War Master, of course, was not exactly stable in his position. Makaroth was already viewed as an upstart, and as someone who didn't really belong in or deserve the elevated position that he was currently occupying. And now there were those who called for another, younger upstart, one of Slado's old favorites, to be elevated into a position where he might conceivably begin competing with the War Master for favor. Again, I hardly need elaborate on why the War Master was probably hesitant to adopt such a well-meaning idea, forwarded primarily by his detractors, I'm sure. Nor was it particularly difficult to find good reasons to deny this sudden and exceptional elevation either. Most obviously of all, of course, the Colonel Commissar had no actual experience with warfare on this scale, and he was fighting against, mere chaos zealots, and he was losing as well. Sure, he'd pulled off a Hail Mary victory in the end, but that was less due to strategic brilliance and more due to, well, a MacGuffin handed to him at the 11th hour. And that was hardly the only thing. He'd also involved himself romantically with a local noble, a very big no-no for the Imperial Guard due to the complications that will near inevitably ensue from such a thing, even though that was kept a secret, I assure you. The War Master's Intelligence Division and the Inquisitions is more than capable of unveiling such silly little secrets. Not to mention, it wasn't going to be a particularly well-guarded secret for long, either. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt had also facilitated a major rift between the local PDF forces and the Imperial Guard. A rift that saw not only the execution of a major PDF officer for a paltry offense in his first engagement, but also saw the near execution of a ranking Imperial Guard officer by Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's own goddamn testimony about the sacrosanct chain of command. Well, only sacrosanct so long as it favors the Imperial Guard, that is. Considering, as we've talked about on numerous occasions up until this point, that the position of High Commander in the Imperial Guard is as much a political one as it is a military one, yeah. For all his achievements, the Colonel Commissar was not ready for such a sudden elevation. The charitable interpretation, then, is that the War Master recognized this fact and decided to not elevate the Colonel just yet. The less charitable one would be that he recognized an obvious rival riding high on the back of a highly improbable victory and decided that this was not a very good time in the Crusade to encourage rivals. And to be fair, he was very much so right, as Heritor Asphodel's sudden return and very nearly successful counteroffensive had demonstrated to the War Master and the Crusade that its overextended frontage was far more vulnerable than they had dared fear. Regardless of the decisions made at such an elevated level, the Colonel Commissar was no doubt just really happy to still be alive, even though he'd be feeling that bruise for quite some time, and he was going to be kept plenty busy hereon trying to make sure that his new regiment wasn't going to tear itself apart. But that will be a tale for another time. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.